Several crews were racing along one of the mountain roads very quickly. They needed to reach their final destination as quickly as possible. In one of the crews sat a girl with blonde hair. She told her companion to look at her. Her companion was a dark-haired boy who was holding something very tightly in his hands. The girl asked him if he was really 12 years old because she was also 12. She wanted to know which of them would be the youngest. The boy replied that he didn't care, she could be his older sister if she wanted. These words greatly alarmed her. She didn't understand how quickly he agreed to everything. She even said that she was no longer interested at all. This can't be, to which the boy didn't even respond. He was so excited about what happened before that he was willing to do anything if she didn't like it. Then he said that he was ready to be her older brother and let her be his younger sister. The girl was not satisfied with this answer either, and she screamed for him to stop because she had not told him that she wanted to be the youngest. The boy did not understand what the difference was between who would be the eldest and who would be the youngest. The main thing was that from now on they would be a family. He didn't understand why he had to have a new family. He looked out the window and thought that he had a family before, but he lost it, and finally found a family again in the face of strangers. This boy's name was Boris Zenaman. He was the second son of Lord Yurkin of Trevage Longord. All the events started 12 years ago, the very moment when he was born and his mother left this life. She lay in her coffin surrounded by many flowers, as beautiful as she was. The nanny held him in her arms at the very moment when his mother lay in the coffin, and there was a sea of flowers around her. Everyone knew that the Zenaman family is a family of brave warriors. They are not used to giving up under any circumstances. The nanny holding the baby in her arms said that he would also become such a brave fighter, and he should have a sword and armor passed down from generation to generation. These were the same props called Winterer and Snowguard. She said that they would share with their elder brother, young Master Evgen, this armor that would be their inheritance. The mistress of this house went to heaven, and the owner hated all the second children in the world. Despite this, young Mr. Evgen was a very kind boy, so he was undoubtedly happy about the birth of his new brother and fell in love with him. At the moment when their area was engulfed by revolution, countless people died, and the young gentleman had to survive in these conditions. You even had the time when their uncle appeared, who was chosen from the family and now dreamed of revenge. When he was a little boy, he didn't understand that at any moment he could become a victim of this struggle and lose his life. But even if a great misfortune falls on their lips or someone decides to encroach on family heirlooms, they knew for sure that there was no need to worry because the survivor would definitely avenge everyone else. That's exactly how it turned out. The responsibility for his family fell on the shoulders of this boy. He knew from childhood that the Zenamans, this is the family he was born into, always remembers everything that happens to them. And most importantly, they always remember the love and kindness of other people. But they can also never forget the harm they caused to his family, so the young master understood all this perfectly well. And he understood that, as a member of this family, he must definitely survive. Survive by enduring all the trials of this harsh world. He knew that, at that moment, you had chosen him, and he had no right to die. In the Zenaman residence, which was located on the territory of Trevaz, lately it has been very restless. The nanny sat opposite the young gentleman and told him that a ghost lived on Lake Ara. She told him to remember her words so that nothing would happen to him. He must not under any circumstances approach this lake. This young gentleman was Boris Zenaman, the youngest son of the Zenaman family. The nanny said that at night the ghost could be seen even from the windows of the estate where they lived. The boy was very scared, but despite this, the nanny continued to say that a ghost can be seen especially in such bad weather as it was that day. The nanny also said that this ghost lurks in the darkness, flashing its red eyes, and waits for little children to dare to approach them. After such stories to the nanny, the young gentleman could never even think about going near this lake, which is why he did not go to Lake Ara. He always remembered the story about his nanny. Then the young gentleman and his older brother were lying on the grass under a tree, and he told his brother about this ghost, who asked him if the nanny said so, to which Boris replied that everyone says so. The young gentleman was so worried that he told his older brother to never go to Lake Ara. And so he was wary of the ghost with red eyes. His brother was very surprised. He tried to calm his younger brother down and told him not to pay attention to the nanny's stories. The older brother wiped the tears from his face and told him that he had nothing to worry about. And then he added that he will always be there because he is his older brother and the eldest son of the Zenaman family, Yevgeny Zenaman. When Boris looked at his older brother, He thought that today his smile was even brighter than usual, but for some reason he still felt uneasy. He also smiled back and said that he would not be upset anymore and agreed with his older brother. Evgen started joking with him. He rubbed his hair and started saying, "I'm flying away, bird, nothing nat call," in his brother's hair. Boris understood that this is how his older brother was trying to cheer him up. At some point he felt the touch of a wooden sword. His older brother said that now the time had come for the promised training and now he needed to impart skills to his younger brother. Boris really enjoyed these trainings and was happy to participate in such trainings. At that moment he swung his sword to hit his older brother. His older brother easily parried the blow and said that he first needed to make sure his opponent was within range before swinging his sword. But despite the fact that the smart gentleman didn't succeed the first time, he didn't despair and took another swing. To which his older brother replied that this time the stance was quite good and he was starting to get it right. His older brother repelled this attack as well, but he praised the young master and said that it was a good attempt. The elder brother did not even imagine that the young master would next say that he would now attack for real and that his elder brother should get ready. Boris actually attacked his older brother and knocked him to the ground. When they were lying in one place on the grass, the young gentleman asked his older brother why he had fallen, to which his older brother replied that he fell because he himself pushed him, after which they lay on the grass for a long time and laughed loudly. They had a lot of fun together. These two young gentlemen were watched by their father through the castle window together with his assistant. His assistant said that he thought that young Mr. Yevgeny was very concerned about his younger brother, and that Mr. Boris looked up to him. Their father's face became even more displeased. He could not be happy for his children. That's why he said that such behavior is unworthy of the heir. It was Jurgen Zenaman, the head of the Zenaman family. His assistant lowered his head, and at that moment he said that now was not the time for games. Jurgen Zenaman turned his head and looked menacingly at his assistant. At the same time, the young gentlemen continued their training. Evgenia told his brother to try to attack again. The young master still had a strange feeling. He did not understand what was going on. His older brother told him to hold the sword as tightly as possible. At that moment the young master looked at his older brother and saw fear in his eyes. But he still didn't understand anything. He swung and tried to attack again. The older brother said that this time he did well and he was a good boy. But he still made a remark because Boris got too close to his enemy, that is to him. The next moment the young master heard his brother's sword approaching, and he saw it right in front of his face. Brother's sword was so close that he didn't have time to stop. Boris fell. His older brother asked him for forgiveness and said that he made a mistake. It won't happen again. At that moment the young gentleman thought that for the first time in his life he experienced the fear that he might die or be killed. He didn't open his eyes for a while and was breathing loudly in his older brother's arms when they were called. A servant was approaching them shouting loudly that he had finally found them and something terrible had happened. They had to return to the estate. The older brother asked what had happened. When the servant approached, he could not catch his breath and began to say that Vlado Zenaman had returned. The servant repeated several times that their uncle had returned, but they stood there not fully understanding what had happened. At that moment Boris realized that, unfortunately, he was unable to control the appearance of a strange feeling that was beginning to manifest in him. The only thing he understood at that moment was that this feeling could be so strong that it becomes a harbinger of trouble, as this time their uncle was on the threshold of their estate. The dog growled and did not let the gentleman pass, to which the gentleman said that she had already forgotten her master Brezhnev. He was very determined and very angry, and not only at that stupid hat that was growling at him. The owner of the estate was in his office sitting at his desk. He was all in anticipation and very upset by the visit of such a relative. His assistant asked the gentleman if he wanted to meet this man. He also asked if he should be allowed into the estate. The gentleman thought for a moment, was silent, and then said that he should come in. The office door slowly opened and light could be seen coming from there. Then it opened completely and heavy footsteps were heard approaching. An unexpected guest entered the room. He told the gentleman that they had not seen each other for a long time. The gentleman thought that the inevitable had come. Apparently it was actually his brother Vlado Zenaman, and he came to him now. It was necessary to understand why. The gentleman said that 5 years had passed since he had banished him, and he asked if he was still alive. Vlado answered, is he really unhappy with something, and does he really want his brother to die? Yes. The gentleman only wanted to know for what purpose he returned to where death had settled. Vlado took a few steps forward, looked around, and said that in this office everything remained the same except that it had become a little dilapidated. Then he added that his brother could offer him something to drink since he had spent the whole day on the road. to discuss an important matter with him. The gentleman did not argue with him and decided that let it be as he said, and 2 glasses appeared on the table. Vlado and I ceremony took 1 glass and took a few sips, then put it back. Without saying a word, he took the glass back and brought it to his mouth. At that moment Vlado asked his brother if he remembered the childhood they spent together. He recalled how they had duels on the fields of Longord and how loud the sound of their wooden swords was. He recalled how they once skipped training and spent the entire day playing in the hills. And then their father scolded him for such an act, saying that older people don't behave like that. And does he remember how he felt at that moment, because it was he who was scolded and punished too? The gentleman interrupted his brother and asked what he needed. Vlado continued drinking and said that his brother should let him catch his breath. But then he changed his mind and said if his brother wants it that way he can get straight to the point. Vlado said that his elder brother should know that the elector Zenaman who stands behind him should become chancellor in the upcoming elections. And when this happens he will become a thorn in the side of the chancellor's Baku in the future union with another candidate. Vlado continued to talk about how he returned to this house for the survival of their family. The master turned his head and said if he was going to talk nonsense then he better get out of his estate. Vlado reminded his older brother that this estate does not belong only to him, and the fact that their parents left this estate to the 2 of them. At that moment the gentleman became very angry, and he reminded his younger brother that he had probably already forgotten how he had deprived him of the rights to this estate. He reminded him because he most likely forgot how their dear sister Yanichka died because of him. Vlado laughed a lot at these words and told his brother to think again. Then his face became as if stone and Vlado asked if it was really his fault. The gentleman couldn't stand it and shouted that it was his fault because these were all his dirty tricks. In fact, if it weren't for him, their sister and her fiancé would be alive now. Vlado began to justify herself by saying that she had not actually gone crazy and did not want to be treated, but that their older brother had allowed them to die. Vlado got angry and shouted that in fact it was he, his older brother, who was to blame for everything, as they say. The gentleman squeezed the glass very tightly in his hand. He wanted to know how he dared to speak like that. Then he threw the glass towards his brother, so that the splashes flew in all directions. He screamed how the scoundrel could throw so many dirty accusations in his face. Vlado looked at his brother and said that so many years had passed, but he had not changed at all at that moment. He wiped the wine that his brother had spilled from his face. In fact, the people who lived in Trevage have always been stubborn. Their family is already being torn apart by factions. Vlado asked his brother if he thought his sons would be any different from them. The gentleman couldn't stand such a conversation and said that his brother should get lost. Vlado got up from his chair and moved it, after which he told his brother that this was his last chance. After these words, they did not stand opposite each other, and each of them watched a video of the enemy in front of them. Vlado tried to say that for the sake of brotherly ties, he was ready to forget all the sins of his brother and forgive him, and that the chancellor would turn a blind eye to his actions. Then he smiled, but it was not a genuine smile, because he demanded in return that his brother give him the Winterbat kit. The master did not serve his brother to the end and told him to get out as quickly as possible, and then pulled out his sword. He was so angry with his brother that he started shouting for him to leave his estate immediately. He shouted that even if his head split into 2 parts he would not give him anything. Vlado, despite the fact that he had his brother's sword on his neck, continued to smile sarcastically. Then Vlado said that his stupidity and truth know no bounds, after which he turned his back on him and went to the exit, saying that he was ready to see how long his brother could hold out when he deprived him of everything. The master called his assistant, and he was ready to carry out any order of his master. The gentleman stood by the window and watched his brother leave, and he ordered his assistant to prepare everything necessary. He gave such an order because he understood that a rebellion was beginning in his estate. It was already dusk outside, and it was raining. It was continuously knocking on the windows. Along the long corridor of this estate, Evgen, who was holding his younger brother in his arms, he asked the service where their father was, to which he replied that their father was on the 2nd floor. Evgen asked the butler, already downstairs. The servant answered that yes, he went to the control area. The servant asked the young master to hurry up and open the door. The door opened slightly, and it was unclear what was behind it. The servant said that it was time. Evgen, I didn't understand if it was really time to use the Winterbat kit. Boris was in his brother's arms. He looked at him and did not understand what was happening. he listened to his every word. Winterbat said this was armor taken from a battle against a foreign lord, 99 enemy fighters. Snowguard and the sword received after 30 years of killing, without a number of enemies. It was winter treasure of the Zenaman family. It was equipment that only the greatest warriors had owned for decades, and rumors had been circulating about it. Evgen tried to pick up the door with a huge closet. When Yevgeny moved this cabinet, he said that now it is as it should be, but it ended up in the hands of the owner. At that moment he took into his hands the very sword that was the legend of their family. A little earlier the gentleman called his eldest son, and said that he wanted to show him something and told him to follow him. The gentleman was telling his son as he walked down the steps that he had probably heard of family religions, which were passed down from generation to generation after it passed, and the grandfather defeated numerous enemies. Boris watched all this. When they went down, the gentleman showed these relics and said that this was the very same Winterbat set, to which his eldest son replied that he had always thought it was just a myth. His father was a little surprised and said that if that was the case, then he had actually managed to keep the secret. And then he added that their grandfather left the set to him and his brother Vlado in the hope that they would divide it between themselves, but that was a mistake, because using Winterer and Snowguard together can unleash their full power. The father said that his eldest son will turn 20 this year, and as the future head of the family, he must understand what his duty is. The father added that if their family is in danger, then his eldest son should become the head. And then he added that he should take Winterbat and run as fast as possible. The boy didn't understand why his father told him to run, but the gentleman insisted that no matter what happened, he had to survive and protect their heritage. This was necessary so that the Zenaman family would continue to live. The young man stood and listened attentively to everything his father told him. The father said that he did not allow anyone to take their inheritance, and asked his son again if he understood everything. Evgen answered that he understood everything perfectly. Because the sword Winterer and the armor Snowguard was the religion of their family, it was the set of Winterbatum. When Evgen showed this set to his younger brother, Boris said that it was amazing. His older brother told him to choose which one he liked best. Boris wondered if he had misunderstood then, because his father had given his brother the whole set of armor. It would be difficult for him to wear, so he liked the sword more. Boris said that if he had the right to choose, then he would take the Winterer. His older brother said that he would give this sword to him when he was old enough to wield the sword, and asked the boy if he wanted to support him. When Boris took this sword into his hands, he could not hold it. He held it with both hands. Then he said that he felt that the sword was too heavy for him. The next moment his brother said that he was doing well, and that he should look at this sword that he was holding. And then he added that Winterer is his sword. Since then his older brother at every opportunity told him that Winterer is his sword. And over time he really began to think so and believe his words. But at that moment he was too small and didn't know what to do with this sword. That's why he kept repeating to himself that this sword belonged to his brother and not to him, and he had no right to it. This time his older brother said that their uncle had raised a rebellion, and that their father knew that this would happen. Now they must act according to the plan. The elder brother held him by the shoulder and told the young master not to worry, but Boris did not understand what a rebellion was, despite the fact that the butler had once explained to him what it was. In quarrels between family members, there are no right and wrong, there are only winners and losers. Then the butler told him that this means that even if many people die, no one will be punished and no one will be honored with recognition or grief. Then the butler added that the young master, like his older brother, is a resident of Triage, and when the time comes the young gentleman will understand everything, even if now he does not understand anything with the explanation. Boris recalled Dvoretsky's words that no one would be honored with recognition or grief. The elder brother took the sword in his hands and asked the younger brother for permission to borrow his sword for a while. Boris stood silently, said nothing, looked at his older brother, to which he once again asked him for permission. And the smart gentleman made a fist in his hand and said that his older brother did not need to return this mark to him because it was his sword. Then he raised his head and looked at his brother and told him that his father had given this sword to him. Evgen didn't expect such an answer. He stood silently and looked at his younger brother and thought how smart he was. The older brother came up to him and put his hand on his shoulder and told him that he was wrong. He told him again that Winterer was his. He had misunderstood everything. And then the elder brother added that he would take it only with his permission and would return it as soon as the uprising ended. Boris was a little confused and told his older brother that he wouldn't even be able to hold this sword, to which his older brother replied that he wanted him to remember how they did it together. He lowered his head to his younger brother and said that even though he was a bit heavy for him now, there was no need to worry. and then he added that his younger brother would soon get used to it and everything would work out for him because in fact he is a wrestler. Then the older brother hugged his younger brother and reminded him that it was not for nothing that he was named Boris. After all, it means fighter or glorious in the fight. The younger brother agreed and nodded his head at that moment. He thought that his older brother knew what to do. The uprising was getting closer and closer to their castle, and from the windows of the room they could see everything. Evgen said unequivocally that everything was starting. None of them could even think about how this could be all the law. The people who were at this uprising shouted that today the head of the Zenaman family would change. They wanted everyone in the estate to hear them. These people were shouting loudly that everyone should lay down their arms and surrender. They had torches in their hands. They demanded that they submit to the new master and demanded that the Zenaman family be revived. The gentleman looked at all these people who organized this uprising and thought only about the fact that their words could only hurt those people who have long been dead. He understood that he did not have the influence that his father had when he was in power, but he had soldiers who were loyal to the Zenaman family. When the rebels came closer, the gentleman shouted that he did not understand who dared to invade Long Ord, and he wanted to see these people. One of the rebels shouted, "Burken Zenaman is there on the balcony," and pointed at him. The gentleman stood on the balcony and demanded that he come in and come out. He didn't understand whether he had decided to hide like a coward when they forced him to come out. The butler extended his hand and lit a white flame that was supposed to stop the people who went against them. This white flame was quite unusual and no one expected to see it. The people who came to the uprising did not understand what was happening and what this magical fire was that was against them. Now other cries were heard. These people were shouting that the traitor Vlado must be executed. These were loyal soldiers who defended the master and his estate. The people who came with fire began to understand that there was a wizard in the estate and they decided to retreat. The gentleman stood on the balcony and shouted that his soldiers were moving forward. Do these fools really think that the Zenamans are in front of a bunch of rabble? The gentleman thought that he would be able to win this fight no matter what because it was a matter of his honor. Raising his eyes, he hurried a little because he did not understand what kind of monster it was that was right above him. He saw the same thing as everyone else. It was a huge monster that was very close to him. For a moment he thought that this most likely exists in the ice world and all of Krieger. The gentleman did not understand how they dared to use such a dirty trick. He knew for sure that in Travaz there were only 3 people capable of summoning Krieger. One of them was the Archmage Confukta Kana Jongun, and it was he who was there. The gentleman could not believe that he had appointed him as Vlado's assistant. He did not understand whether his brother had really strengthened his position so much. The gentleman shouted for everyone to leave the estate immediately and ordered the 2nd Battalion to hold its position. A few moments passed and it was clear that the tower was collapsing and a large number of people could be hurt. The gentleman understood that now the main task was to evacuate people while the 2nd Battalion was fighting. He needed to come up with a plan. The gentleman heard a familiar voice and turned around. His eldest son told Boris that they needed to leave as soon as possible. The gentleman called his eldest son and asked him to come over. Then he told him to go alone because his youngest son Boris was staying with him. Evgen tried to object, but his father didn't even think about backing down. He asked his eldest son if he was really going to drag the child along with him. The gentleman tried to explain to his eldest son that he must understand that Boris needs protection more than anything else now. Then the gentleman ordered him to leave as quickly as possible. Tears appeared in the young man's eyes, but he was not given a choice. The very next moment Evgen turned around and began to walk in the other direction, and the father and his youngest son went in the opposite direction. One of the soldiers called Mr. Jerkin and young Mr. Boris. They wanted them to disappear as quickly as possible. The boy didn't understand why his father told his brother not to take him with him. He knew he was just a burden to him. In fact, he remembered his father's words, but he said that no matter what happened, his eldest son must survive and protect their legacy. Boris understood that his older brother really had to survive and protect the family heirloom because he was not able to do it. Well, the boy was tormented by doubts. He had a strange premonition again. He didn't fully understand how to explain it, but he had a premonition that something would happen to his brother. Evgen very quickly ran away from all these events because he had a completely different task. The ice dragon was getting closer and closer, destroying everything in its path. People were in shock. The soldiers who were loyal to this family tried to hold back the soldiers who started this rebellion. The butler approached the gentleman with his youngest son and said that most of the people had been saved but the estate itself had been destroyed. Boris was upset but did not fully understand what this could threaten him with. When they returned with their father and saw the state of the estate, they were shocked. They stood for a while in silence watching what had happened to their estate. The gentleman shouted that his brother was a son of a bitch. He did not understand how he dared to destroy their house, and he as a member of the Zenaman family would never forgive him for this. He then ordered his assistant to check the condition of the 1st and 2nd battalions. His assistant used magic to see how things were going with the 1st and 2nd battalions. He saw that, as I expected, the situation was not in their favor. Moreover, the estate was now unsuitable for use. The gentleman said that in that case they would not attack both entrances. He ordered the remaining soldiers to be divided into 2 groups. They should hide and wait for his command. Boris asked his father why he was doing this, because there was a monster there. The father replied that they would simply not approach him and told his son to stop whining because he was a man. The master said that the monster will not touch the living beings of this world because half of its body remains in another dimension. Immediately after these words, the gentleman stepped aside with his assistant and continued the conversation. The boy was very frightened. It was night outside and the moon was shining, illuminating everything around. The assistant had to use his magical powers and help the master. When it became completely dark outside, they tried to get as close to the estate as possible. The gentleman told his youngest son Boris that he should follow them now, and when the battle began he should run into the field. The boy listened carefully to his father and asked only one question after he ran into the field where he should move next. The father thought about it because he had no answer to this question. He had nothing to say to his son. After thinking for a while, he said that he should run towards Lake Ara. It was so unexpected for the young gentleman because he always knew that he couldn't go to this lake because ghosts exist there. He tried to object to his father because his nanny said that a ghost lives on the lake. The master answered his son, does he really believe the words of the old maid? And after that he dares to call himself a member of the Zenaman family. The gentleman said that because of these stupid rumors no one would dare to go there, so that is the safest place. Near the lake the young gentleman should see 3 trees with black trunks. He should hide there, and then his father will come for him after the battle. The gentleman asked his youngest son again if he had understood everything correctly. The boy said something but no one heard him. The gentleman's assistant came up and said that it was time for him to go. There was very little time left before he would start to have sex with himself. The gentleman stood up and shouted loudly to all his soldiers to listen to him carefully. Then he shouted for them to attack the eastern entrance. The soldiers who were harmful to his family and who remained alive immediately went on the attack. The gentleman got a little angry with his son. He shouted, what is he waiting for? He had already explained everything to him. He should get up and run. Boris stood a little confused. He was too small to participate in such events. He closed his eyes in resentment, but he had no choice because his father was right. His nanny was probably making it all up. So he turned around and ran towards the lake. He convinced himself that he should run towards Lake Ara as his father had told him. After the Lord sent his army to attack, it was met with a worthy selection. It seemed that he was exactly there waiting for him. Vlado was pleased with what was happening on the battlefield. He shouted at the soldiers to come as close as possible. The closer they get, the more he will be able to kill them all without leaving any of them alive. Vlado was ready. He took out his sword, with which he quickly destroyed the enemy. His sword was really that fast, and he dealt mercilessly with his brother's army. Vlado was only interested in one question: where is his brother? He stepped on one of the bodies that was lying on the ground and said that his brother treated him like trash, kicked him out, and Ravel's family and inheritance. Now his older brother is hiding from his younger brother with his rat tail between his legs. One soldier's voice was louder than all the others, and he shouted that he had found Jurkin Zenaman. This soldier shouted that the master was right here. Vlado turned his head and looked that way. Vlado thought that it was not long now that the black blade of Hagrin would soon be replaced by the silvery white Winterer. The gentleman stood surrounded by several of his loyal soldiers, and the enemy army was approaching him from all sides. He wanted to know only one thing: how dare they rebel against him, and how could they invade his territory? Immediately after these words, he went into battle. The gentleman told his opponents to become silent and begin the attack as quickly as possible, because he will make them pay for the reckless bravery they had. At that moment he heard the voice of his brother, who was standing behind him. His brother said that he was glad to see him again, and at that moment he pierced him from behind with his sword. The voice of the gentleman's younger brother was so confident that he understood that he had struck from behind. When Vlado pulled his sword out of his older brother's body, Mr. Junker staggered and could barely stay on his feet. He turned around and looked at his little brother and said that he was a bastard because he hit him in the back. Vlado was pleased with what he had done and said that his older brother could not control everything and that he was no longer the same as before. And then he added that apparently the years are proving themselves and he is no longer as strong as he was before. As Vlado approached his older brother from the front, he struck again, piercing him with his sword. The gentleman was bleeding profusely. It was the end for him. He couldn't resist his younger brother. His assistant tried to come to his aid as quickly as possible. Vlado said that if he gets closer, he will be next. He is not going to stop. Vlado stood in the middle of the battlefield as a winner because his older brother, who could not resist, fell to his knees in front of him. At that moment, the soldiers did not understand what was happening because a fog came from somewhere and they could not see anything. This fog was the work of the master's assistant, so he was able to protect him, at least he thought so. Vlado got very angry and started shouting at both of them that they were saving their own skins, that his brother is terribly pathetic and unbearable to look at. Vlado waved his sword, trying to break the fog that settled around them, but when he began to see something, he saw that his brother was gone. And this made him even more angry, and he realized that he could not defeat his brother. So he ordered his soldiers to find him immediately because his older brother was wounded and could not go far. "You are at this very time, young master," and with all the strength that he had, he ran towards Zero. He couldn't think about anything, only about the words his father had told him. He needed to find trees with black trunks. Boris didn't even take a breath and didn't stop anywhere. He thought about the very place where his father sent him. The young gentleman ran closer, stopped, and realized that he had found the very place where his father had ordered him to hide. He thought that his father had told him that he would find him right here where the trees with black trunks stood. In the meantime, the young gentleman decided to sit down near one of these trees and catch his breath. He had no choice but to sit and wait where his father told him he had no other choice. Time passed, and the young gentleman continued to sit near one of these trees. At some point, he became terribly scared and heard a sound that was incomprehensible to him. The young gentleman was shaking all over with fear. He didn't understand what was happening, and he was scared. At some point he thought that maybe it was his father who came, or maybe it was not so at all, it was the ghost of this lake. The sound he heard at some point very quickly stopped. He no longer heard anything. But he was still very scared, and he didn't understand what to do. He was alone in the place that he considered the scariest place in this life. Then the boy felt something fly around him. He didn't even have time to react to it. And the next minute some force pulled him back, and he couldn't resist it. Everything happened very quickly. He was clearly being pulled somewhere, and it was not of his own free will. The only thing that came to his mind at that moment was that it was the ghost of this lake. When he saw this creature, he became even more scared, and he understood that most likely the ghost exists, and it was him. The boy thought that his nanny was right after all, but he wondered if his father really didn't know that the ghost existed. Didn't father know that there were monsters in this lake, and one of these monsters was right in front of him right now? He didn't understand why his father didn't tell him anything and sent him here. He was scared. He closed his eyes and thought that no, he really doesn't want to die, and he called his father. And then he called his brother. What was his surprise when his brother came to his aid and freed him. Boris, when he was freed from this monster, fell to the ground. I don't understand what is happening. When he raised his head, he was very surprised by everything that was happening. Right in front of him stood his older brother holding that very sword in his hands. Boris still didn't fully understand how they could meet on this lake, but the brother hurried to his younger brother. As Evgen came closer to his younger brother, he looked at him with a high expression. Then he shouted at him, I don't understand why his little brother ended up here. Boris also didn't understand what was happening and asked his older brother again what he meant. Then his older brother hugged him tightly, and Boris tried to explain how he got there. The two brothers stood there hugging for a while and were happy that they had found each other. Evgen told his younger brother that he was very worried about him because he could have died. Boris tried to explain that his father told him to wait for him near the lake. Evgen didn't understand how this could be. Did his father really send his younger brother to trial alone? Boris asked his older brother what he was doing here. He heard perfectly well what his father said, that his older brother should guard Winterbat. Evgen looked at his younger brother and didn't know how to answer him correctly. Then he was silent for a while and said that he did not agree with his father's opinion because family is more important to him than any relics. And then he added, what is the point of all these religions if they all die? He said that anyway they will not be able to protect them forever because their life is not infinite. Boris asked his older brother how he knew where to look for him. Evgen answered him that in fact he is his older brother and he always knows where he is and must protect him no matter what. The younger brother stood and looked at his older brother. He was really happy to see him. At some point he saw that a fairly bright light was shining through from behind him and it was unclear what it was. The brothers turned and looked in the direction where the light was coming from. Boris asked what it was. His elder brother asked him to listen to him very carefully. Evgen tried to explain to him that his uncle is not their only enemy and that behind his uncle is the Elector of Khan. And most likely it was he who sent all these warriors and magicians to the lake and they are already very close. Elector Khan most likely wants to get Snowguard and Winterer and also to gain the loyalty and cooperation of their family. The older brother began to explain that in order for their enemy's plan to work they decided to take their father out of the game. But their father knew everything in advance, so he expected them to strike at any moment. That's why he hasn't been very talkative lately and has always been stern. Evgen explained to his younger brother that this was why their father told them to run away. The brothers froze and stood watching the open ports to see what was happening. What was their surprise when they saw this bright light approaching and becoming very close to them. Their father and assistant approached them. Yevgeny asked his father what happened. The assistant answered that the gentleman was wounded with a black sword. This black blade was received from the Elector of Khan, and it was endowed with a powerful poison that does not allow the body to recover. Even the magic of the assistant cannot heal and turned out to be useless. The gentleman's assistant turned and asked his eldest son Evgen if he shouldn't already be far away from here. The young man stood looking at his father. Behind him stood his younger brother Evgen, trying to justify himself. The assistant said that it didn't matter because they were all fine. The young gentleman said that they had just seen a bright light that suddenly flashed and then disappeared. The gentleman heard such words and said that it seemed to him that he had left and the estate, and he most likely suspects that the Eye of Quetzal was activated. That's what spells of heightened vision are called. With this spell, a Jongun mage can find even a needle in a haystack in just half a day, and if they saw a flash it means their location has already been discovered. Evgen asked your father if everything is so bad, then what should they do in this case? Their father said that they could only hope that luck would be on their side. The father ordered his eldest son to leave and did it as quickly as possible. Evgen tried to say that he would stay with his wounded father, but the gentleman insisted. The master's assistant had to carry out his master's order and repeated what the master had said. He said that young Mr. Evgen left this place as quickly as possible. Boris was so confused and didn't understand what was happening around him, why everything was happening like this and what he should do. The assistant ordered the eldest son of the master to follow the will of his father and protect the family and the relic that was in his hands. The sound that was heard around was that of horses that were rapidly moving forward. It was Vlado with several of his assistants who were always near him. He started forward and wondered if they were really that close and if his two nephews were such fearless brats who went to the lake. This lake of ancient times inhabited the islands of the inhabitants of Longord and was one of the forbidden places. Besides, it was quite a scary place that everyone in this estate was afraid of. It was this place that took away their only sister. Warm hands closed the eyes of a little girl and asked her who it was. The little girl without a doubt said that it was her brother Vlado, and she guessed right. At that moment Vlado remembered how it all was in childhood, and his sister was the only person from the family that he cherished. He remembered how she could hide from them somewhere in a closet and then fall asleep without waiting for them to find her. And when the brothers found her, she was fast asleep. The only disagreement was between the brothers. From the very beginning they quarreled over every little thing. And only their sister could try on. She took them by the hands and told them to make peace quickly. The fairy tale ended when she was gone. And it was from then on that Vlado believed that he was living in a nightmare. He did not understand how his older brother a fly could send his sister to that family, to which his brother replied that he really was from another faction. She immediately made a decision herself. They could not do anything more. He said that they really can't do anything, they can only wish their sister happiness. Vlado was not going to put up with this, much less wish for happiness. He thought that this was all nonsense, and he thought that in this case there was only one way out. He went to his sister and told her that he had heard that her fiancé had gone to Lake Ara. His sister was very scared and surprised. She understood that I was finished. The girl knew that it was very dangerous and she tried to stop her fiancé. Then her brother looked after her and thought that his lie had worked and he would be able to achieve his goal. Vlado planned everything. He thought that she would go towards the lake and there his subordinate was supposed to kidnap her, and he thought that it would be better because he couldn't let her go yet. Well, actually his plan didn't work because everything didn't go according to his plan. After some time it was reported that the young lady who went to the lake had died. Lady Yanichka died because of the ghost of the lake and no one could help her. Vlado stood there crying and didn't understand why it happened this way because his subordinate was waiting for her by the road. She shouldn't have come near this lake. The older brother pushed him away and told him to step aside. Vlado tried to shout to his sister and said that they needed to call a doctor. But then they said that his sister no longer belongs to this world. That is why the gentleman told his younger brother that even if he was against her engagement, he should not have done so. Vlado tried to explain to his older brother that he didn't want this, but no one could hear him anymore. He would never have thought that his younger sister would decide to go to this lake, and how was he to know that the ghost of Zmira actually exists? Then the elder brother said that his excuse was useless, and then added that from now on he was no longer Zenaman. The elder brother ordered everyone to return to your mansion. Vlado did not understand what his elder brother was going to do. Vlado was very scared and asked his older brother to ask him. He promised that he would find a way to fix everything. In fact, the madness caused by the ghost can only be cured in one way. You need to kill the infected one. Jurkin took out his sword and went to the one who used to be his sister Vlado to stop him and asked to let him go. But all this was useless. His older brother did not hear him. He destroyed what was left of his sister. When Vlado arrived at the territory of this lake, he ordered his soldiers to search the entire territory. He told them not to miss a single inch and to find representatives of his family immediately. When the soldiers began to carry out their task, they heard an incomprehensible sound that was coming from very close by. This sound became louder and louder, and turning their heads to the lake, they saw a huge monster coming out of it. This monster was so scary and made the same scary sounds as itself. The soldiers immediately became scared when they saw these monsters coming out of the sewer. Vlado tried to stop them and told them that they were cowardly bastards who dared to disobey his orders. He swung his ball and tried to destroy these monsters, but what was his surprise was that these pipes continued to advance. They were getting closer and closer, and he began to smell them. It was a disgusting stench. Lake Ara. Vlado thought that he would most likely be lying if he said that he was not afraid of them, but if as a result he defeats his brother, then he will destroy every vile ghost that will be in his path. His father's assistant told young Mr. Evgen to get out of there as quickly as possible. He should have obeyed his father's will and protected the family religion. They are very close. They will surely find them, so he needs to leave as quickly as possible. Evgen replied that he would not leave. He would stay here for his father and brother, and this was his last decision. The assistant said that he feels that Vlado is somewhere very close and he feels that danger is rowing. Evgen asked his father's assistant if Venturbat was not saved for such purposes, wasn't it needed to counteract danger? Evgen answered him that his father had his own path and he had his own, and he had already chosen it. The father looked at his eldest son. He had nothing to say in response because he was right to some extent. Evgen asked your younger brother Boris if he understands what we are talking about. This question put the young gentleman in an awkward position. He did not know the answer to it. In fact, the youngest gentleman saw when the relics were handed over to his older brother. And in fact, the young master always took care of his older brother, and he thought that he did not want to live in a world where there was no brother and no father. Evgen turned to look at his younger brother Boris and said that he would consider it an honor to die together of their own free will. Boris looked at his older brother as a hero and was ready to trust him completely. Evgen said that he is ready to take his family and not part with them, and if necessary he will fight to the last, and until then they will stay behind. Evgen also added that when the time comes to confront the enemy, he does not intend to retreat. Boris thought that it was at that moment that he understood why his brother's eyes were usually blue that day, and his smile was as extraordinary and bright as never before. He had never seen him like this. It was at this moment that Boris realized that he had a ban on EV action. These were troubles. Therefore, the only thing they had left to do was to get closer to that very lake about which there were bad legends. All four of them went to this lake and got as close to it as possible. At that moment, the gentleman said that they were there and they would stay here. He looked at this lake and thought that she was somewhere nearby. He knew that she must be somewhere here at the trap of the evil spirit, and her soul will forever remain inconsolable. He looked at the corner of the lake. From behind, he heard his brother's voice and asked him if he was really looking for Yenny just now. The gentleman turned around and saw Vlado together with the magician. He accused his brother of not deigning to give their sister even a grave. At that moment, Vlado told him that their sister would be glad to see her older brother, who killed her by piercing her with a sword right in the heart. The gentleman replied that his younger brother would never be able to admit his mistake. Vlado asked his older brother if he had come to ask his sister for forgiveness. The gentleman replied that it was too late for both of them, and he swung to hit his brother. Vlado told him that it was wonderful, and he thought that they should resolve their long-standing feud before the ghost with red eyes appeared. The gentleman closed himself off and struck his younger brother, said that he was a bastard and that he spared his life, but he still did not realize his own sin. After all, in fact, with his sharp tongue, he made their sister a corpse unworthy of good treatment. The master's assistant put up a protective field against monsters. In fact, the gentleman believed that his brother put their sister on the same level as these crawling monsters. Vlado asked his older brother if he still blamed him for her death. I tried to remove it. I was trying to strike one blow after another. I couldn't come to an opinion. Everyone remained with their own. Vlado believed that it was not he who took their sister's life. After all, it was he who pierced her heart with his ball, and after which she stopped breathing. Vlado believed that this had to be ended here and now, otherwise it could go on for quite a long time. His older brother agreed with him, and he believed that this had to be ended before the Reedied one showed up, so he tried to attack, but his attack was unsuccessful. Very close by was the eldest son of the master, who was trying to stop those monsters that came out of the lake. There were more and more of them, and they were approaching him. Evgen told his younger brother to listen carefully because the ghost with red eyes took their aunt. When he shows up, he doesn't know if he can protect him with the help of Snowguard and Winterer, but he has to do it. Boris turned his head and looked at his brother. He didn't understand how he was talking about a ghost. He asked his brother if he hadn't killed him in the forest. Evgen didn't know what to answer him because he had never seen this ghost before. The hands of the young man who was holding the sword for some reason began to shake. He could not fight with it. At that moment, Boris realized that their father was completely right when he said that only by using Winterer and Snowguard together can their full power be released. It was then that he ordered his eldest son that he must survive and protect their inheritance. Evgen reassured himself that he would be able to take at least the first blow and block the ghost. When it appeared, his brother should definitely survive. Evgen stood waiting for the ghost when he would appear and when all this would happen. Boris looked to the side and was so shocked by what he saw that he couldn't even say a word. The elder brother was completely ready. His Snowguard was glowing with a bright light. The older brother could only say 2 words about the fact that this monster was here, because he saw his red glowing eyes. Boris stood to the side without moving and did not understand what was happening. He only had questions. Then he couldn't help himself and asked his older brother what happened. He asked his brother several more times but received no answer. Boris stood surrounded by a sea of blood, and behind him I heard someone's terribly nasty laughter. Then a voice was heard from the abyss that said, "What a cute child," and he saw 2 huge red eyes. Boris was so scared that his mouth stood still for a while and watched everything that was happening. Then he sat down and lowered his head down. He needed to catch his breath from everything he had seen. When he raised his head, he did not understand where he was, and next to him lay a sword. At that moment, he heard his older brother calling him. He turned his head and saw Evgen. His older brother asked if he was already awake, so let him drink some water. Boris sat scared, looked at his older brother, and did not understand what had really happened to him. Evgen looked at his younger brother and didn't understand what was going on. Why was he looking at him like that? Was he having some kind of nightmare? Then out of nowhere, Boris jumped up and hugged his older brother so hard that they almost fell over. Boris held him tightly and had no intention of letting him go under any circumstances. So his older brother couldn't hold on and fell onto the grass on that lawn. Evgen didn't understand why he was so excited and why he attacked him. The older brother said that of course it was him, his brother. It was unclear what was wrong. Boris held his older brother tightly in his arms and thought that he had definitely been at Lake Ara. And he clearly remembered how how his father fought with Uncle Vlado and how he decided to end all the misunderstanding. How they hit each other, I'm not going to leave my opponent alive. And at that time they together with Evgen stood and did not allow the monsters that crawled out of this lake and surrounded them to pass. Boris wanted to clarify what happened next. After all that he remembers, Evgen said since the water spilled he will go and bring it again. At this point Boris asked his older brother where they were now. Evgen replied that they were now north of Lerngord on the territory of the Gillam family. And he also added that they got here on this horse. Boris slept very soundly the whole way. The young gentleman wanted to know where his father was. At that moment Evgen lowered his head and said that their father had gone to another place. Then he added that everything went wrong and they decided to split up. Young master, he wanted to know how they would then find their father. His older brother told him not to worry, their butler would contact them soon with magic. Boris wanted to know what they needed to do now. Evgen thought for a bit and said that they could visit their granny because they were on good terms with their father. Or they can go to Prince Kachi whom he serves. Boris was a little upset by this answer, so he asked his older brother if they could not ask for help from strangers and live like commoners. Evgen thought about it and then said he doesn't even know if they will succeed because they have always been under the care of many people. This year due to crop failure public sentiment has worsened, they are unlikely to be accepted. Boris asked his brother again if he was sure that their father would contact them soon, and he suggested that for now it would be better for them to live a quiet life. At that moment the young gentleman began to purr. He demanded food because he had not eaten anything for a long time. The older brother looked at Boris and said that for starters he suggested they get some refreshment in the nearest village. When they got to the nearest village they went into one of the public places. The young men opened the door slightly and asked if they could come in, to which the owner told them to go in. Evgen said in a confident voice that they needed one room please. The owner looked at the young people and smiled. They seemed very suspicious to him. Then he said that one room would cost 10 elsos, and did they have that kind of money? Evgen took a gold coin out of his pocket and put it on the table in front of the owner. Then he said that it was incredible, but everyone should see what rich gentleman had come to visit them. Because carrying such a large sum of money at such a young age was surprising for them, and also paying with gold coins, they were interested in the question of what brought these young gentlemen here. Were they really interested in seeing what a tavern for a commoner looked like? The owner handed the young men the key and asked what they would like for dinner and what they would like for breakfast. To which the young gentleman replied, whatever you like. The guests were truly surprised. They didn't think that such noble persons would eat whatever they wanted. Evgen told his brother that they should go and not listen to these people. Those sitting in the tavern discussed that most likely these young people do not even particularly imagine what is happening in the real world. Others said that maybe it is because of the baby food that they look as if they have just learned to walk. The third changed and said why don't they go home and eat something more noble. At that moment a plate of soup was placed in front of Boris, and the owner of the goods asked for forgiveness for the wait. People in this version wanted to know how they liked this dish and how the young gentleman would eat it. Boris, when he saw that they were falling, was very scared and closed his mouth because it was unacceptable. There was a bunch of worms again. When Boris saw this picture, he jumped off the table and fell to the floor. The visitors began to ask the young gentleman why he was so surprised and to tell him to come quickly because he had to try their signature dish. Others understood that the young gentleman was seeing such food for the first time. And most likely he doesn't even know how to eat it. One of the visitors stood up and said, "Can I show him how to eat it?" This man approached the young gentleman, put his hand on his shoulder, and said that if there was anything he should contact. Evgen looked at this gentleman and said that he was ready to use his services and wanted him to teach them how to eat it. He looked at this man and said, "Eat at least one spoon so that we can see how it should be done." This one stood there. The goods turned to everyone sitting so that they could hear everything because he was being asked to be the first to give an answer. He turned around and said that he was actually not that hungry to eat someone else's food. At that moment someone's hand grabbed him from behind. Evgen grabbed this guest by the neck and slammed him against the table so that he would understand his mistake. And then he added that since this is a signature dish, he has no right to refuse this food. Then he told this guy to move to their table and he held him by the neck so he couldn't move. The lodger started screaming to be let go and the young gentleman took his hands off him. Pastilai didn't understand if he would really make him eat it. Evgen scooped up some of the worm soup and brought it to the guest's mouth. At this point Boris tried to stop his older brother by saying that he was very sorry and that he was wrong. Boris had never seen his older brother so angry as he was this time, and that he can do this to this person, actually destroy him in front of everyone else. Evgen turned to look at his brother, but he had nothing to say in response. Then he released his hand from the guest's neck and told him to say thank you to his younger brother. And he also said thank you that he is not so cold-blooded as to put a worm in someone else's mouth. The spoon he had with the worm soup fell onto the table that stood in front of them. The young gentleman said that they would eat later and went to their room. The other visitors to this store were very outraged and started saying that some brat couldn't afford such a thing. They didn't understand how he could just leave. Evgen stopped and looked out of the corner of his eye at everyone around him. At that moment he assessed the situation and then struck one of the visitors who was standing closest to him, and that guy flew away. The guy who was lying on the floor could not come to terms with what he got from the young man. He called them an impudent weapon and added that he was ready to teach them a lesson. Evgen did not stand on ceremony, grabbed the handle of his sword and was ready to pull it out. He thought whether he should use Ventern or well, catch himself thinking that no, then he will be able to finish the job. In that case, he decided that the best weapon would be the chair that was right next to him. Without thinking twice, he took the chair and threw it towards the guy who was the loudest in his indignation. But this guy wasn't going to give up, and that made him even more angry. He shouted to everyone else to grab the young master. They thought they could teach him a lesson. Evgen, despite the shouts of these guys, was completely confident and dealt blow after blow to whoever came closer to him. At that moment, he heard his younger brother Boris screaming to be let go and calling for help. Evgen saw that one of these guys was holding his younger brother by the hair, and the other was holding his hands. Evgen couldn't allow anything to happen to his little brother, so he didn't resist. These guys grabbed the young gentleman, and they talked about how they had to behave decently in other people's company right away. Evgen raised his head and said that they were vile cowards. The trusted host approached the young gentleman again and said that such a wonderful feast had been arranged for them, but they had created a disturbance. He demanded that they understand how to behave at the table. He approached Boris and addressed him. The young gentleman was very frightened. The man asked the young gentleman why he didn't take the chance. He grabbed the young gentleman by the face and tried to open his mouth to teach him manners. He brought a bowl of worms to him. Evgen started shouting at that guy that it was enough. He didn't understand what they were doing because in front of them was just a child. This gentleman looked at his older brother and said that this is very touching brotherly love, but if so then he should eat instead of his younger brother. Evgen answered him that okay, he was ready to do it and let them bring this plate to him. The owner was so faithful he was too surprised whether he could eat it himself, and what a proud aristocrat he was, but if he had such a desire he did not object. Then he put the spoon with worms in his mouth and asked him what he would like to try. And then he added that if he refuses now his brother will have to eat these worms. Evgen looked at this guy and didn't say anything to him. Then he just opened his mouth to eat the spoon with worms. At that moment he had such a face that he was ready to destroy the whole world for what they did to him. The owner of this establishment was a little scared. He couldn't even imagine that something like this could happen. Everyone else also sang the hymn. They didn't understand how he could just go and eat the worms. Was he crazy? Boris shouted to his brother how he felt and if everything was okay with him. Evgen shook his head without saying a word and made a long pause. He swallowed everything that was in his mouth because he wanted to respond to this mockery. Then he said that his name was Eugen Zenaman, and he was the eldest son of Jurgen Zenaman, Lord Longord. The man who had just bullied him was very scared because he couldn't even imagine who he was dealing with. Then the young gentleman said that he officially challenged this guy to a duel. The tavern patrons began to whisper among themselves, is this really Lord Longord's son? Is this guy really a nobleman? If so, now they have serious problems. Evgen looked at these people and said that the owner who made fun of him in this way should say his name. The man did not resist for long and said that his name was Git Philanita. In fact, he was very scared. Evgen told this man that of course now he must kill him. He simply has no other choice. Then, after thinking a little and looking at him, he decided that he was ready to give him a chance and atone for his guilt. The young man said that during a duel his opponent must admit his defeat and lie face down on the ground. Only then will he be able to visit him. Or else he swore on the name of his family that he would make him eat everything that was left in that very plate of worms. The younger brother was a little scared and worried about his older brother. he didn't understand how this could end. He thought to himself that he had already seen his older brother wield a sword, but he had never witnessed his duel. He caught himself thinking that in front of him was a completely different person. At that moment, his older brother told his opponent to renew his sword. His opponent was very scared and thought only about one thing: were the Lord's son really going to kill him? This guy from the tavern was so scared that he couldn't say a word. He just opened his mouth in surprise. Everyone else who was nearby also froze in surprise. They had never seen such a blade in their lives. The opponent of the Lord's son began to talk about what he had already heard about him, that there was rumors that somewhere in this world there was a sword called Winterer. It was this sword that was in the hands of Evgen, and the young man was determined to punish his opponent. His opponent wondered if this was just a rumor and if this sword actually existed, in which case it would be dangerous for him to fight face to face. The only thing that came to his mind was that he decided to attack the young man first. He swung his arm and tried to hit Yevgeny, but he failed because the young man parried his attack. At that moment, the tavern guy thought that his opponent really had great strength, and most likely it was all because of the sword. He looked at the young son of the Lord and understood that he would never retreat and that he had great strength. The next moment, Evgen threw his opponent aside so that he couldn't even resist. His opponent had no intention of stopping and thought he could try to strike again. This guy with the tavern had no choice but to step forward and strike, which is what he did. Evgen once again parried the blow that the enemy tried to inflict on him with the same sword that was in his hands. When the young man parried his opponent's blow, he forced him to kneel down, and his sword could not withstand such force and broke in half. The guy from the tavern looked at his sword and couldn't even imagine what would happen to it next. He didn't understand what just happened and how he was able to easily cut his sword in half. Gaida looked at his sword and did not understand how this happened because it was completely unbelievable. The only thing he understood was that it was all over. Evgen was not going to stop and leave his opponent unpunished. He swung to deliver the final blow while telling him to say goodbye to his life. At that moment, the young gentleman saw the eyes of his brother's opponent, which asked for only one thing: mercy. The next moment, the young master's opponent lowered his head and, closing his eyes, began to ask to be forgiven. Evgen looked at his opponent, listened attentively to everything he said, and then asked him if he really was admitting his defeat. At that moment, his opponent suddenly raised his head and shouted so that everyone could hear, "Yes, of course he admits his defeat and the victory is for the young master." Evgen, without thinking twice, answered him that then he knew what he had to do if he admitted defeat. His opponents had to eat everything that was in the bowl. He brought a stew with worms. Boris was a little surprised by his brother's behavior, and he tried to stop him, but his brother was determined. He said that he would not repeat it twice. The guy who brought them the soup had no choice but to eat everything that was in this bowl himself. He scooped up some with a spoon, then closed his eyes so as not to see that he was holding up a card, and put the spoon with worms in his mouth. Everyone around started saying that it was unbearable. How could it be? And he himself understood that it was simply unbearably disgusting to do this. Then he started spitting, and the next moment he turned over the bowl of worm soup so that it spilled all over the table. My guy from the tavern felt so bad and disgusted that he couldn't come to his senses for some time. Boris stood next to him and looked at him. At that moment, the older brother called Boris. The boy turned his head and looked at him. Evgen said as if nothing had happened, so that his younger brother followed him and began to leave. When they entered their room, there was a candlestick on the table and a candle was burning. It was already evening outside. Boris, sitting on his bed, thought about everything he had just seen in the tavern. Then he called his older brother. Evgen turned around and asked what he wanted. The older brother wanted to know if something was bothering his younger brother, but he sat there thinking about something and kept silent. Evgen came closer to his younger brother and asked him again if he wanted to know something. Then it would be better if he said it. At that moment, Boris answered his older brother that he was very glad that he was completely fine and that nothing had happened to him. He was glad that his older brother had won this fight. Boris then added that at some point he felt that his older brother had become someone else. Boris continued to speak, looking straight into his older brother's eyes, saying that he didn't think his brother had done anything bad, but he knows for sure that his older brother had no other choice, and he thinks if their father were here he would definitely praise him. Evgen, having listened to his younger brother to the end, said that he did not quite understand everything correctly because in fact no one knows him better than his younger brother. Evgen sat on the bed and added that he thought their father was right, and he believes that from now on he must act according to his will. and his younger brother should not allow sympathy to make him soft-hearted. But Evgen told his little brother if he could protect him forever he would make sure he grows up to be a man with a kind heart, but he won't always be there. And then he added that his younger brother has his own path, and in order to find it he must become truly strong and ready for any challenges. The older brother told him if he can't be a rock then he needs to become a shell to close the shell, so no one can see what's inside him. Evgen tried to explain to him that he should as soon as possible realize everything that was happening around him. And most importantly, he must realize that the world will never leave him alone. Boris couldn't resist and asked his older brother why he decided to become a shell. Evgen thought for a bit, looked towards his brother and answered him yes, that's why. Boris looked at his brother and understood that it was his choice, his older brother's choice. At that moment he thought that perhaps his brother was afraid that he would grow up weak because there was no father or soldiers around anymore. Evgen told his little brother that it was time to sleep, but he shouldn't take off his armor because someone would decide to sneak up on them. Evgen added that he will keep watch, so that his younger brother can sleep peacefully. Then he came up to him, stroked his little brother on the head, and added that he would wake him up at dawn. That night was dark, and only the round moon shone and illuminated everything around. Boris, despite being tired, could not fall asleep. He lay there, and remembered everything that had happened to them recently. His brother, as he said, was sitting next to his bed, and he really was guarding them. Boris wondered why his brother was sitting with his back to him, because it hadn't blossomed yet, and he wasn't asleep yet. When he got a little closer to him, he was very surprised. He could not have expected this. His brother's cheeks were rolling down and falling onto the sword, and then onto the floor. He had never seen his brother in such a state. That's why Boris was so surprised that he didn't know how to react to it. Evgen, in order not to upset his younger brother, sat with his back to him and covered his face with his hands. Boris even thought at some point that he was sleeping because it couldn't be that his older brother was crying. He thought he should calm his older brother down and tell him that everything would be okay, but he couldn't get the words out. Boris did not want to embarrass his older brother and decided to turn to the other side so as not to see this. Boris felt so uneasy that tears started rolling down his eyes too. He understood that this was all just because his brother decided to become a shell. When the next morning came, they decided to continue on their journey. I still don't understand where it will lead them. Evgen showed to keep quiet, hold the reins of the horse on which his younger brother was sitting. Boris was also not talkative. He did not know how to calm his older brother down. He had never seen him in such a state. Boris kept remembering that very moment when he saw his older brother sitting next to his bed and crying. He understood that it was the first time he saw his older brother crying. He needed to say something, but he didn't have the words. At some point Boris couldn't stand it and broke their silence. He asked his brother what the name of the flower was that was growing right in front of them on the field. Yevgeny did not raise his head, said that this flower Vasilek seemed that nothing could calm him down. Boris said that he understood, but he thought to himself that earlier his older brother would have immediately started telling him legends and interesting facts. Boris could not resist and asked him if he had really forgotten all the stories about flowers. His brother was silent. They spent the whole day in silence. The sun was setting behind the mountains and the day was ending. It was already getting dark, so they stopped to figure out what to do next. Evgen looked around and said that there was no settlement nearby. Most likely they would have to set up camp. After some time, the two brothers were sitting near the fire. Despite everything, they continued to remain silent. There was something suspicious about this silence. Boris looked at his older brother and for some reason he felt very anxious. At that moment his older brother abandoned Vichka and called his younger brother. Evgen told his younger brother to get ready and take the sword and looked around. Seeing someone in the bushes, he asked him if he had followed them all the way to sit in the bushes like a coward, and then added that with so many comrades there was no need to hide. Someone's footsteps were indeed heard from behind the bushes, and then this man laughed and said that everyone should look at these impudent boys. The next moment they could see a guy standing in front of them with one hand holding a huge axe. This guy told his men to surround these boys. At that moment the horse neighed very loudly. Boris looked towards his horse and saw how it quickly ran away somewhere. The brothers stood waiting to see what would happen next. Evgen looked at his opponent and said that he had enough defenders. It was the same Git with whom they had already dealt in the tavern. This man decided to take revenge on them. One of the guys who were chasing the young lady hugged Gaida and said that if they think they are here to help him, then that is not true at all. They do not understand what situation they found themselves in. Evgen didn't think long. He pulled out his sword. Everyone realized that this was the same Winterer. The question was whether this was really a mark that his family had been hiding for decades. Evgen thought that it was not very good that they understood what kind of sword it was, but he justified himself by saying that he did it within the framework of a fair fight. But he still blamed himself because he was Eugen Zenaman, and he was the eldest son of Jurgen Zenaman Lord Longord. He knew that revealing his identity to them was a mistake. The guy who had an axe in his hands shouted to his subordinates to take the sword from Evgen and start attacking him. Despite the fact that there were many more opponents and they were older and more experienced, they tried to surround the young gentleman from all sides in order to take his sword away from him. Evgen did not wait for this to happen. He took out his sword to repel their attacks. At that moment he was calmer than ever and understood what he had to do. He felt strong. The enemy began to attack the young gentleman from several sides, and two of them tried to strike him at once, but Evgen did not lose his head and repelled both attacks. His strength at that moment was so great that he penetrated and moved back. Evgen looked at them and said that people like them have no right to hold this sword in their hands. Then he swung and struck a few blows himself to push these guys back as far as possible. At this point he added that these guys don't even have the right to dream about this sword. One of the opponents managed to stay on his feet unlike the others, and he said that the young gentleman was not bad at all in combat. Then he took a few steps and told the young gentleman that he wanted to see how he could handle it and started attacking him. Evgen stood in anticipation of a new attack. He was ready to once again repel the attack of his opponent. At that moment he heard his brother's voice warning him to be careful. Evgen realized that someone else was attacking from the side. Boris shouted like that because he saw chains flying towards his brother and he couldn't do anything. This chain spun the sword that was in the hands of the elder brother so quickly that he did not have time to react. When the sword was completely wrapped in a chain, they began to pull it so that the elder brother would throw it from his hand. Evgen turned his head and saw the big guy who was holding this chain. This big guy was laughing and telling the young man that he was good until the end, but now it was all over for him. The brute said that in such a state he would not be able to do anything, so he had no choice but to give birth to his hand and give up the sword. But at some point everything did not go according to their plan, and the robbers who attacked were very surprised by what was happening. Despite the fact that the thug was really bigger and stronger than the young man, he could not pull the chain to take the sword from him. Evgen held it very tightly in his hands, and at the moment of danger the sword began to shine with such a bright light that it blinded everyone. The next moment the CP that was around this ball crumbled into small pieces. It seemed that it was not made of metal at all. The robbers who attacked couldn't see anything because there was a very bright light. They didn't understand what it was. The only thing Boris understood was that the iron chain seemed to have split into small pieces. One of the guys who had just threatened, when he saw with his own eyes what he had only heard about, realized that it was a great honor for him. It was a legendary power that would lower the temperature of any object the wearer touched to an extremely low temperature and eventually tear it to pieces. It was called Winterer's freezing rupture. All these people were able to see that same freezing break of Winterer that Evgen showed. The man with the axe told the young man that the sight of it alone made his mouth water. He looked at Evgen and said that he was quite a skilled guy. And then he added that the young man would most likely tone down his ardor if his younger brother had a hole in his stomach and didn't think he was too young to die. Evgen was a little surprised because he didn't understand when he managed to capture his younger brother. He understood perfectly well that they had surrounded them and were seeing their every move. If he had been alone, it would not have been difficult to break through this ring, but Boris was with him. At that moment Boris said that 12 years is quite a long time to understand this world. These bandits didn't understand what this kid was saying and started laughing at his words. Boris continued to say that he knows when it's time to die, and he knows for sure that he will definitely not die at the hands of this robber. The robber put the axe on his shoulder, laughed, and said that they would see if it was true. Then this robber swung his arm to strike the young gentleman. He wanted to do this so that she would frighten the boy as much as possible. Boris was a little scared because he didn't understand what to do next, but he knew that everything would end well. Evgen rushed to help his younger brother. He tried to save him. Swinging his sword, this robber said that now the young master will answer for his arrogance. When the older brother ran up to his younger brother and tried to protect him, they saw that the arrow had hit the robber right in the neck. Blood splattered in all directions and drops of blood fell on the young master. Evgen hugged his little brother, trying to protect him from everyone else, and this old fairy robber fell right on the ground in front of them. The others didn't understand what happened. They were screaming, trying to figure out what it was that was stuck and where it came from. But the next moment there were already many such arrows, and they reached their target. Then the robbers realized that this was an ambush and they needed to get away quickly. Evgen continued to hold his brother tightly, realizing that one of those arrows almost hit them. he was tormented by the question of who shot. When everything became quiet, he heard footsteps and then a voice that told him that he had fought well with these guys. Evgen looked in the direction from where the voice was coming from and saw 4 people in cloaks with deep hoods, so that their faces were not visible. Evgen was on guard. He took out his sword and was ready to fight further. He asked who they were. The guy who was talking to them told him that he could have spoken politely to his saviors. Evgen answered him if it was a selfless act, then he thanks them. In response, he heard laughter. This guy asked the young master if it is not so, does he have something to repay them with? Evgen thought that these people had paid off those who almost killed them in no time. He understood that they obviously knew their business well, but they were clearly not allies, and if they were enemies then they were much more terrible. One of these people said that it seemed that before them were noble gentlemen who were learning about the world. It was unlikely that they would have anything for them, in which case the warmth of their fire would be quite sufficient. Evgen didn't quite understand whether these people really helped them selflessly, but he decided that it was worth thanking them for their help and said that they seemed to be experienced fighters. Then these guys took off their hoods and started introducing themselves one by one. The first one said his name was Walls Cam. The second one asked to be called Joachim because he didn't have a last name. The third guy, who had one eye closed, said that his name was Romanbak Yul, and he was known as Romanbak from Brulta. The last girl introduced herself. She said that her name was Yannicka Goes. Usually they call her Yani or Nika. Evgen hugged his brother tighter and started to say that. They then stopped and thought. The guy with one eye looked at the young gentleman and said that it seemed that they did not trust them, yet this was a common thing. If their presence caused inconvenience to the young people, then they were ready to leave. The brothers looked at each other. They had to make a decision, and they said unanimously that everything was fine and their salvation could remain. After all, they only asked in return to warm themselves near their fire and demanded nothing more. The brothers, along with their saviors, also joined in and sat down near this fire. They sat opposite each other without saying a single word. At some point, one of the arrows of the Kaf could not stand it and threw an apple, telling Boris to catch it. Boris caught this apple and continued to hold it in his hands for some time. Nika looked at the guy and said that he was very smart because he didn't rush to her right away, and then added that he shouldn't be afraid because it wasn't poisoned. Then she told her older brother that his younger brother was still too young to wander around such a wilderness. And then she added that they travel doing different jobs. Sometimes they go somewhere specifically for a profitable deal. Then she asked if the young people had heard about the land of mortals. Evgen thought for a bit. He asked again what the land of mortal girls could mean and took several drags from the very pipe that was in her hands. She began to say that a long time ago there was a legendary magical kingdom of Canaroli, where the columns were covered with gold, and the ground near the elephant was covered with precious stones. The new war destroyed everything, leaving only a wasteland where the living dead wander and ghosts tear people apart. She said that the land of mortals is a place from which no one returns alive. It was getting dark outside. They continued to sit around the fire listening to this girl's story. Nika asked them if they were really shocked by her story because her older brother looked as if he had imagined the worst possible thing. Evgen answered honestly, it is hard to believe that they returned from there alive. After all, in reality, the land of mortals is not a place where you can easily enter and just as easily exit. The name itself speaks for itself. Another one of the shooters said, did he really think so? Then he told him to look at the arrowhead that was in his hands. If he looks closely, he will see liquid that is on the tip itself. He explained that one must be as careful as possible with this liquid because it is a poison so strong that it can even kill a ghost. The girl stood up and told Romabak to stop because they didn't actually enter the territory of Canapoli. They just wandered around its surroundings and collected the golden trinkets that the inhabitants had previously worn. The girl asked the young men if they wanted to see something interesting and then took a bracelet out of her pocket. I held this gold bracelet in my hands, and it seemed like it was glowing with a bright color. Then she threw the bracelet to Boris and told him to catch it. Bori took it in his hands and began to examine everything that was drawn on this bracelet. He realized that there were drawings engraved on it. This bracelet had dancing people on it. It was very fine work. He had never seen the Golden City, but he looked at this bracelet with pleasure. Boris thought that after this, he could imagine it in the smallest details, shimmering under the scorching sun, sand, towering golden columns, and roofs of the temple inlaid with rubies. It was amazing, but he again felt a bad feeling. The next day they found a small settlement where people lived. They decided to go to the nearest tavern. "Come on, open the door and then go inside." The owner of this inn said welcome and told them to pass through. The owner was a little surprised because there were a lot of them and he didn't understand who could be knocking at such an early hour. The owner looked at the Strelkovs and said that they looked tired. Nika tried to explain that some difficulties had arisen and they were unable to spend the night in the open air. She explained that they had walked all night to stop here. Evgen and Boris could not sleep among the corpses, so they followed the shooters. The owner of this establishment threw them the keys so that they could settle in. Nika added to the young gentlemen that their legs probably couldn't hold them up, so they needed to rest a bit. Evgen thanked her, holding the key to the room tightly in his hand. The arrows were climbing up the stairs. I wish the young people good dreams, and they also wanted to get a good night's sleep. Boris started wiping his eyes and telling his older brother that he was very tired. As soon as they entered, he suddenly felt very sleepy. Evgen replied to his younger brother that they could now finally catch their breath, so they should go to bed and rest. They did so because they thought that there was no one else to pursue them. He dreamed that he was in his estate playing with toys near the very tree where he usually played with his older brother. Boris turned his head towards the voice that was constantly calling him. He saw a young man in front of him, but he didn't understand who it was, so he asked who this man was. The man who came up said that he was his uncle, but in fact he saw him for the first time. This uncle said, "Come closer, is it fun to play alone?" and asked the boy what he wants. Uncle showed what real fun means. Boris answered, "I want." The next moment his uncle took him by the torso and lifted him up. Boris really liked it because he was hanging in the air and few people lifted him up. As a little child he always liked it when people played with him. His uncle raised him higher and higher above his head. At one point he said that Boris would never forget, and they couldn't wait to see the expression on his face. Then he held it in his hands where he still did not understand, but it was all unexpected for him. Then the boy saw a well standing in front of him and that they were approaching this well. At this moment Boris became very scared and started asking his uncle if they were really going to this well. Then the boy began to ask his uncle to let him go because he was very scared. But despite these requests and cries, his uncle still held him tightly in his arms and did not let go, and he asked to be put on the ground. Boris opened his eyes and started screaming loudly. He still didn't fully understand that it was a terrible dream. He was lying on the stone floor and felt that he could not move his hands. His hands were tied behind his back. Evgen was sitting not far away. When he saw that his brother woke up, he asked if everything was okay with her. Boris tried to get up and ask his older brother where they were now. Evgen answered him that they needed to get out as soon as possible. Winter disappeared. Boris didn't understand what it meant that he disappeared. He didn't understand how it happened and who could have taken him. The older brother laughed because he realized that they were trapped. Boris still didn't understand what had happened to them. Evgen couldn't calm down. He just laughed and couldn't stop. Then the older brother said, and even had to be in such a situation, and then continued to laugh. Evgen told his younger brother that he too is just a child who does not understand how the world works and therefore does not always have an answer. Then the older brother added that he hopes that in the future when he reaches his age he will be smarter and will not let people fool him. If his father is not around from that moment on, he will start teaching him what he should have learned from him. Then the elder brother became very aggressive and told the younger brother that it was time for them to stand up and pay in full to those who dared to deceive them. After some time, a loud noise was heard in a straighteye where the young gentleman stopped for the night. The owner of this tavern fell and attacked without even understanding what was happening. He couldn't hold his sword in his hands. The older brother said that they don't have time to play and so he's not going to talk to him for long. And then he added that he asks again who tied them up and locked them up. This time Evgen was serious enough and had no intention of forgiving his offenders. The owner of the tavern answered the young men that he knew that he shouldn't have gotten involved in this because those guys didn't say that he could fight, and he turned out to be not an ordinary boy. Evgen picked up the sword from the floor and the owner of the tavern got even more scared. He said that there was a scoundrel with them who had control over him. Evgen stopped. He didn't understand what scoundrel meant and why he was saying that. The owner of the tavern could not stand it and shouted that it was precisely because of this measure of Yannick that everything happened to them. The young man couldn't even imagine that she was the head of the gang they met yesterday. He was very surprised that everything that happened to them happened because of her. The innkeeper explained that her gang sold the young men to the Golden Spear mercenary group because they used the men as labor until the shadows pay the ransom. and then he added that very soon this group will come for them in order to get theirs. Yevgeny department only find out where the gang of Yannicka is now because most likely it was they who took the sword from them. The owner of this establishment said that most likely he is not in that Helmer, usually her gang works at night, so today he will hit the road again. Evgen turned around, looked at his younger brother and said, "What does it mean tonight?" Then he turned around and ordered his younger brother that they were leaving this establishment and that they needed to hurry. They did not linger, left the establishment and hurried to the tavern where Yannicka's gang was supposed to be. The older brother ordered his younger brother to hide and watch what was happening from where he was now. Boris nodded his head. Evgen, after hiding his younger brother, went inside this establishment where the same gang that stole the sword from them was located. Entering this establishment, the young man thought that deceivers and traitors should be punished with particular severity, and he thought that Boris would see all this because he did everything for him. Of course, his older brother wanted him to remain a kind and innocent child as long as possible, but they didn't have time. Opening the front door of this tavern, Evgen thought of only one thing: to see his offenders. It was quite dark inside, and I could hear someone calling the bartender, asking him for another glass. At another table, they were discussing how another noble family had recently been destroyed. Evgen saw 100 at one table. There were really two people from this gang sitting. These were Cam and Joachim. He needed to find out where the other two had gone. The young man walked up to the shelf where the dishes were and picked up one of the trays standing on that shelf. Then he walked as close as possible to the table of his offenders, holding a tray in one hand like a waiter. When he came closer, he asked these people sitting at the table if they had called him, and they couldn't even recognize him. One of them asked the other if he had called the bartender for something, and he answered no because he thought he had had enough drinks for today. Then Evgen told the two that the lady outside was asking them. These guys did not understand how this could be because Yannicka went to meet the merchants and said that she would meet them at the entrance to the village. They didn't try to figure out what was happening because it was strange to them. One of them raised his head and said that this couldn't be happening. This is because it is not yet time for them to meet her, but at that moment they saw Evgen and understood what was going on. Then they both turned towards him. They were very surprised despite the fact that they had already drunk quite a lot. One of them started asking if it was really him, and at that moment he got hit on the head with the same blow that was in the young man's hand. The next thing the young man did was take out his sword, which he still had. And with this sword he pierced his opponent's hand, so that he didn't even have time to react to everything that was happening, after which he screamed loudly in pain because his arm was completely damaged. The second shooter shouted to Joachim what had happened to him and asked the waiter who he was. Evgen, without thinking twice, bent down to pull the sword from his opponent, adding that the alcohol had most likely completely knocked out their memory. Evgen stated that he came to this tavern with only one purpose: to pick up his sword, so he asks them where it is. The second of the shooters jumped up and tried to hit the young gentleman, but he was too drunk. Evgen asked these two shooters again where his sword was now. He held a blade in his hands, but he held it quite confidently. That's why he was able to repel his opponent's attack. The shooter said that it was none of his business and he wasn't going to tell him anything. Then this shooter tried to lock himself again to hit the young man, but it was quite difficult for him. At some point he saw that the young man's blade was very close to his neck. At that moment Evgen looked at his opponent and said, despite the fact that he is a thief, he is also a pompous scoundrel. Evgen ordered him to speak before it was too late, otherwise he would cut off his wrist. The shooter couldn't utter a single word, to which the young man asked him if he really didn't want to live. At that moment Evgen hit the table with all his might so that the second shooter's hand was damaged even more. Evgen looked at both of them and waited for one of them to start talking. He knew it would happen at any moment. Here the robber, whose hand was chained to the table with a knife, could not stand it and was the first to say that the sword was with Yannicka. And then he added that Yannicka and Romabach were planning to sell him and split the money, and the second one started shouting that his friend was a traitor and that Yannicka would never forgive him. At that moment he managed to get out from under the blow of the young man who had stopped him and tried to swing to hit him. But he didn't succeed, so he hurried out of this tavern as quickly as possible before Yannicka came for their heads. The second one, who remained sitting at the table, started talking about his friend, telling Yannicka that he had done something that was cancelled. And then he added that he knew perfectly well that everything would turn out this way, and he shouldn't have gotten involved in this dirty business. He said that Yannicka went to bargain for the sword, but it was just a formality. Most likely she plans to keep it for herself. After all, Romabaka's main weapon is a crossbow, so he insisted on selling it and wanted to split the proceeds. At midnight, at the northern entrance to the village of Yannicka, a group of mercenaries meets. This shooter said that if she sees a young man, she will immediately rush to give them this sword. And he also added that the young man should remember that she is a very dangerous woman. Evgen told him that he would probably regret it if he didn't return Winterer. The next moment he pulled the knife out of his hand. Drops of blood dripped onto the table. Then he said that he was letting him go so that he could go and not get in his way anymore. It was already night outside, and it was time when Yannicki was going to meet to sell the sword. The elder brother told his brother to follow him, and they went to the very place where the deal was to take place. Evgen understood only one thing: he needed to return the family religion that his father had entrusted to him. Boris looked at his brother and understood that, to some extent, they were both to blame for what happened. Evgen stopped and, without turning to his younger brother, said everything he saw in the tavern was terrible, but what he will see next will only get worse. Then he told his younger brother to look at the blade that was in his hands, which was covered in blood. He gave birth to his hand and began to talk about how not only their father but he too was capable of killing. Then he drove the blade into the ground and looked at his younger brother again. Boris thought to himself that this was most likely not true and that his older brother was not the kind of person he was now saying. After all, he saw everything because he was on the street and he could see everything that was happening in this tavern. Boris believed that his older brother acted this way only because he was protecting him. Evgen said that in order to save those who are dear to him, he is ready to do anything, even murder. Boris looked at his older brother and wanted to say something, but he interrupted him and said that he should take care of himself. Evgen once again repeated to his younger brother that he would do anything for him, but he also had to take care of himself first. He should have valued himself more than any treasure, be it a relic or anything else. The elder brother said that he should defend as fiercely as professional soldiers do, so that even those monsters that surrounded them on the lake couldn't kill him. And they also did not dare to hurt him as their uncle did to their father, or just quit like what happened to their aunt and they still don't know what happened to her. The elder brother told his younger brother to fight constantly and put his hand on his shoulder. He explained that these are his rules for him to survive in this cruel world. On the edge of this village, they saw two silhouettes who were talking to each other. Most likely these two were the ones they needed. Evgen, when he came a little closer, saw that Winterer was not visible. He decided to watch them. Evgen noticed that Vals was also not nearby, but he thought that he would be here. The two brothers hid and watched everything that was happening. At some point, Boris told his brother to look. From the opposite side, a fairly large number of people were approaching. They were aggressively disposed. Evgen didn't understand what was going on, but decided that they needed to follow it to the very end. Apparently, those same mercenaries were approaching from the side. He had heard that they were renowned warriors seasoned in battle. As they got closer, one of them, he was the captain of the Daraki mercenary squad, said that they had unfinished business. After that, he took a few more steps forward to get as close to Yannicka as possible. The girl said that it was a great honor for her to meet Captain Daraki of the Golden Spear. The captain didn't talk for long and said that they were waiting for compensation because the boys they sold to them had already run away. The girl laughed and said, "Really, but it's not their fault that the captain and his team were late, and even more so that they were missed. They completed their task." The captain said that he would be brief or the compensation would be double. Either these two had to join their ranks and work for them. Yannicka was very indignant. She started shouting that the captain and his mercenaries were behaving dishonestly because they had not agreed on this and they would not get anything from them. Her companion told her not to act rashly and told the captain that of course they would compensate for the losses because they had been cooperating with them for quite a few years. He did not understand what use they could be in the squad. And he also added that most likely they can only disrupt their coordinated work, so the easiest thing for them to do is return the money to the captain. The girl screamed that they are petty bastards. And then she threw a bag of money right at their feet, shouting at them to choke on it. The captain of the mercenaries said that this will not work. He clearly stated either pay or work for them, but if they do not want to, then they will kill them. Yannicka couldn't calm down. She understood that they really intended to take double payment, but then she thought that she had a way out. She turned to the captain of the mercenaries to ask him to answer her question: do they really require her to work for them until death? Her partner didn't understand and asked her if she was seriously going to get hurt. The girl said of course not. She asked after all they are not obliged to work for them forever. The captain silently listened to everything she said. And Tim answered that he would let them go if they completed the first task, and this task was that the senator from Trevage was for 50 people but 2 died in an accident, so they needed to replenish the numbers. The girl smiled again and said, now everything has become clear to me. Then she took her ka off her head and said she doesn't know what exactly they will have to do, but the main thing is to show results because that's why they want to take them on the team. When she took off her hood, the very sword that she stole from Evgen when they were put to sleep was visible from behind. Yevgeny carefully watched everything that was happening, and he was the first to notice this sword hidden behind her. Yanina said that in that case they don't agree, but then so that the captain doesn't go back on his words. At that moment Evgen came out of his hiding place and ordered Yanina and her friend to stand. At that very moment he pushed himself to jump and land right next to her. The captain stood silently, not understanding what was going on. Where did this young man come from? Yanina was also very surprised, only now she realized that these 2 young men had not run away. Evgen landed on the ground right next to the girl, and he took out his sword to engage her in battle. Evgen told her to return the sword to him immediately. He was not going to leave the sword with her. The young man came closer and repeated his demands again. He told her to return his sword to him. They stood silently, not understanding what he was doing here and how he could have gotten here at all. Evgen stood looking at them. It seemed that everything around him was turning red, and his eyes, which were always blue, were also turning the color of blood. Yannicka was not at a loss. She said that it was very fortunate that those whom the mercenaries were looking for came into their hands themselves. Then she said that in that case they could go because they no longer had any obligations to the captain. The next moment she saw the glint of a sword that was very close. Evgen asked the girl on what basis they buy and sell people. There is no slavery in this country. To which she replied if he was caught because he wasn't bright then he should have sat and kept quiet. Who was he to teach a pro? And then she added that he should save his snot for his mommy. Evgen couldn't resist and told her that she wasn't a pro at all for him and he wasn't a greenhorn at all for her. Boris couldn't stand it and shouted that they tied them up while they were sleeping. Can this be called skill? And is this something to be proud of since they acted dishonestly when they tried to deceive them from the very beginning? Boris, I will remind you of the words with which they approached, because they then said that they see before them noble gentlemen who are learning about the world, and it is unlikely that they will find anything for them. The warmth of their fire will be quite sufficient. Then they gave them an apple. This was their way of trying to get closer to them. And then they showed something else interesting, and it was a bracelet with a lot of different things drawn on it. Everything they did from the very beginning and showed from the very beginning was all untrue. Boris shouted that they were real cowards who were afraid to fight even small children in a fair fight. Boris said that these people took advantage of their trust, and in fact they are not warriors, they are scammers. These 2 stood and could not object to anything because in fact it was so they thought that this boy was very impudent. The mercenary captain said that it seemed that opinions were divided. Janina did not understand what he was talking about. She said again that if the fugitives returned they were free, and told the captain to return the money she had thrown to him. The captain couldn't hold back and shouted at her to fight. He said that whoever wins this war can leave peacefully and whoever loses will stay. The captain also added that in any case they will take the loser with them. There were 2 left on the battlefield, the older brother and his opponent, the same one who stole his sword. Evgen wanted to make sure that the sword was with her, so he demanded that she draw her sword. The girl behaved calmly. She didn't even imagine that it would be in the west. Naturally she thought that victory would be hers. She pulled her hand back to get the sword that was behind her back. Then she thought that no, if she used this blade the captain would surely take it away. And at that moment she pulled out another blade that she had, and she shouted that her hands were itching to turn it into a piece of meat. The girl didn't think long and swung to deliver the first blow. She thought that she could kill the young man with the first blow, and this thought gave her strength. Evgen, at the moment when her blade was near his neck, thought that she was really very fast, and it will be quite difficult for him to cope with her, but he did not despair. The girl swung again in order to try to attack. At that moment she shouted that the young man was a complete nonentity, and that he was only bragging and could. These words touched the young master. He was not so simple, and therefore he repelled all her attacks as quickly as she dealt them. He had to step back a little because he felt at some point that he couldn't fight back. Yannicka was very fast in delivering blow after blow, and some of them reached their target. The young master's face and neck were covered in blood. But he understood that he could not lose this fight under any circumstances because his opponent had that very sword, the heirloom of his family. Boris looked at his brother and thought that his opponent was too strong. He had already inflicted several wounds. On the other hand, bringing back Venturer is quite important, but not at the same pace as his brother is trying to do now. Boris raised his head and looked up. Someone or something distracted his attention from this fight. He became interested in who was at the top of that tree. Boris didn't know how to find out, but it really bothered him. At that moment Boris heard a cry of farewell. He abruptly turned his side and looked at his older brother. He saw that Yannicka was attacking his older brother, and he barely managed to fight off her attacks. Evgen couldn't handle her attack, and the blade of this girl was directed at his chest. Boris didn't understand why he was doing this and why he let her so close to his body. Evgen was confident in his actions and fully understood that what he was doing was part of his plan. When Yannicka came even closer at that moment, the elder brother's hand weakened, and he dropped his blade. He grabbed his opponent by the shoulder with one hand so that she couldn't get away from him. Then he tried to hug her. The girl did not understand what he was doing and what his plans were. Evgen did all this only for one reason: to take from behind her back that very sword that belonged to their family. She didn't understand what was happening and started asking him why he was doing this. This made her very angry, and she tried to yell at him, but it was no use. It was all too late. It seemed that she was frozen in this position and could no longer move because she was made of glass. Boris and the others didn't understand what happened. They thought it was magic, and most importantly they saw that it was glowing. Yannicka stood in one pose and glowed as if she was a statue and could not move. Evgen took from her the sword that belonged to their family. Evgen was silent for a bit, turned to the others, and said that the duel was over. About whom the cancelled body of Yannicka continued to stand and glow in the hands of the young master was the very sword that he was supposed to keep. For him the duel was over. He stood and felt like a winner. That's why he told everyone else that he had won. He was completely sure of it. The captain of the mercenaries said that he agreed with him, and in that case he would let them go. At that moment the younger brother ran up to his older brother, and he was very happy that everything ended like this. Yannicka's friend who was with her could not come to his senses. He did not know and did not understand what they did to her. He thought that things had gone too far and he couldn't leave it like this, so he took out his crossbow. At that moment when the two brothers were reunited and rejoiced that they were free, their opponent did not think so. His arrow was already loaded into the crossbow and he aimed it at one of the brothers. Evgen saw out of the corner of his eye that their opponent was about to shoot, and he couldn't let that happen. Already in the next moments several daggers were directed towards the enemy, so that he did not have time to press the crossbow. He only felt pain. The brothers turned and looked in his direction and heard a cry that something had happened to his hand. Then they saw him fall to his knees and try to pull the knives out of his hand. The captain of the mercenaries told him how dare he play tricks in front of him. Then the captain shouted very loudly. He called Naya, who was on the very tree where Boris noticed her. It was she who threw those knives and caused damage to the young master's opponent. This girl always had two knives in her hands, and she handled them very skillfully. The mercenary captain ordered her to grab this loser who tried to disobey him. She needed to jump off the tree and take a few steps to be there. This girl had long white hair and huge lilac eyes. In all her movements she resembled a cat. After the captain's order, she quickly moved towards this loser. The shooter did not expect such a turn of events, so he was very scared. The girl made two more jumps and was very close. She swung to attack him. The shooter could only raise his crossbow to repel her attacks, but the girl did not stop and continued to attack. She tried to strike, but at some point he dodged the blow. Once again she struck her opponent so hard that he could not hold the crossbow in his hands and threw it away. She stood opposite the shooter and looked straight into his eyes. She understood that she had completely neutralized him. The shooter couldn't even move because her knife was near his throat, and one move and he would already be dead. The shooter began to tell the captain that he was getting rid of his old partners like worn-out shoes. Would the captain really side with this scum? He didn't understand whether their mere appearance had awakened some pathetic maternal instinct in the captain. The captain didn't answer. He only ordered that everything be cleaned up here. The captain's men immediately grabbed the shooter and tried to take him away. He screamed loudly to be let go. Evgen looked at the shooter and told him that it seemed like he hadn't really thought about the role of his mother, and he wondered if he could say that in his mother's presence. And then he added that while he was alive it was better not to catch his eye at all. If he stopped at the level of the beam, the shooter could not answer him. The girl stood and looked at her brothers. Her face seemed terribly sad. She did not utter a single word. Boris also looked at her. He didn't understand what exactly, but most likely it was her gaze. It was somehow different. It was her gaze that he felt then, and raised his head to see who was there on the tree. At that moment the captain said that it was a good job and it was time for them to go. The girl followed the captain. The captain and his team turned around and went back in the opposite direction, and in the end he said that their job was done. At that moment Boris thought that Yannicka and her gang never asked why they were on the run. Most likely they were planning to deceive them from the very beginning. They are most likely just scammers. Boris thought that the horse they were riding had run away and their money had been stolen. He didn't understand what they were supposed to eat or where they were supposed to sleep. This worried him greatly. But at least he thought his brother was safe and they got Ventura back. At some point Boris felt discomfort. His thoughts were mixed up and he couldn't think. He stopped in his thoughts and decided to decide who it was. The first thing he thought was that they were being attacked again. All this was because he couldn't breathe. Someone's hands were squeezing his throat very tightly. At that moment he started asking his brother for help. He screamed for him to help him. The only thing he said was the word brother. He opened his eyes and saw someone's silhouette, and most importantly, he saw someone's eyes and they were filled with blood. Boris was able to push the man away so that he would remove his hands from his throat and so that he could continue to breathe. When he pushed as far as he could, he started coughing because he couldn't get enough air and fell back. At that moment Boris opened his eyes and felt that he was sweating all over from what he had experienced. When he saw that everything around him was calm and he was in the forest, he realized that it was a dream. But despite this, his throat hurt from the fact that someone was squeezing it. He thought about his brother. Where is he? He turned his head and saw that his brother was lying on the ground. At first it seemed to him that he was sleeping. When Boris came closer, he was a little surprised his brother didn't react to him at all. The first thing Boris thought about was why his older brother was lying so strangely. He asked his brother if he was okay. Well, his older brother didn't react at all. He lay on the ground with his eyes closed and didn't answer him. Boris then thought that he must be just tired and sleeping very soundly. That's why he was tossing and turning in his sleep. At some point he thought that they were being ambushed again. Boris took a blanket and covered his older brother with it. He decided that he would sleep, and also, he said good night to his older brother Layak next to him and also fell asleep. His older brother began to toss and turn again and mumble incomprehensibly. Then he opened his eyes and looked at the sky, and it seemed like there was blood all around. Evgen suddenly screamed immediately after he opened his eyes. It seemed it was all because of the pain he had endured. The next morning was quite sunny, and the two brothers reached the nearest settlement very quickly. They knocked on the first store that was on their way, and opening the doors they saw a salesman. Evgen immediately told the seller that he would like to sell something. The elder brother pulled out an object from his pocket that was wrapped in a red handkerchief. He took off the scarf and showed this thing to the seller and asked him how much he could offer them for it. The seller said that he wanted to look at this mirror. It was really good and well preserved. The seller said that everything was fine, but it was still a bit old. He saw initials on the other side of the mirror and immediately offered the brothers 300 elso. The older brother looked at this mirror and thought that it would be very difficult for him to part with it. Then he said that he thought it was very little. It was actually worth much more. The buyer said that it is not new and to try to get more of the delayed thing and robbery. If this price does not suit the young people, let them go to another place. He thought for a bit and said that the young people would think that no one would give them more than 200 elso. Then he added that he doesn't know which lady this mirror belonged to, but this design is no longer in fashion. Boris looked at his brother and tried to ask him whose thing it was and who it belonged to because it was very valuable to him. Boris answered no. He understood perfectly well that they had no money at all and they needed something to eat. Evgen of course understood that this amount did not suit him completely, but he said that we had a deal. His younger brother looked at him and understood that Evgen was doing this not only for himself but also for him, selling him an expensive thing. After some time they were sitting at a table in one of the taverns. The older brother said that Boris was attacking the food because he was most likely hungry. Evgen also started eating, saying that everything that was on their table looked very appetizing. For some reason Boris was not happy. He thought how he could eat it if it was bought with money that was given to them for an expensive thing. He thought that he would never give that mirror away for 300 or 3,000 elso because it reminded him of his mother. Boris thought that bread and water would be enough for him. He wanted to know how long Evgen would protect him so much. So he asked his older brother when their father would contact them. At that moment an unnatural smile appeared on the older brother's face, and he began to say that this would most likely take some time. He also added that he is sure that their father is healing his wounds and will probably want to see them when he is suddenly in good health. Then the older brother said that this is why they should eat well and stay strong. Only in this case and not soon will be ready to visit the father, therefore the younger brother should eat well. Boris listened very carefully to everything his older brother told him. Then he agreed with every word he said and said that his older brother was absolutely right. But Boris thought to himself, could it be that his older brother really didn't want to see his father? Otherwise it was unclear why he looked so sad. He only tries to smile, but he doesn't do it well. As soon as Boris closed his eyes, he clearly saw hands, exactly the ones he saw last time in his dream. Then he saw that some man was sitting on him and with these hands was trying to strangle him again. Boris then thought that it was the same dream again, and he was dreaming, and he tried to open his eyes. He couldn't see the man who was trying to strangle him, but he clearly saw his red eyes. Boris was thinking about only one thing: why does he keep having this terrible dream? At that moment Boris slightly opened one of his eyes. He saw clearly the shoulder of the very man who tried to strangle him. Then Boris looked up and saw part of his head and a bit of his face. The man who tried to strangle him was his older brother. What was his surprise when he realized this? Boris opened his eyes and couldn't even tell himself what his brother was doing to him. He saw his eyes, which were bloodshot, and it seemed that they did not understand anything at all. He clearly saw that it was his brother, but he couldn't understand how this could be. At that moment Evgen, without releasing his hands on his younger brother's neck, lifted him up so that Boris tore him away from Paul and hung in the air. Boris began to choke and try to free himself from the hands of his older brother. Boris began to kick his legs hard and hit his brother several times to make him take his hands off his neck. Boris succeeded. His brother let go and the boy fell to the floor. His older brother continued to stare. At one point, Boris fell to the floor with a crash, but it was better than dying from being strangled by his brother. Boris, having caught his breath a little, tried to ask his older brother what had happened. He looked at his older brother and did not understand that with him. Evgen had the impression that he was under some kind of magic. The only thing Boris noticed was that the sword that belonged to their family was glowing very brightly. At that moment Boris realized that his older brother was going to take the sword into his own hands, so he shouted no. Then Boris grabbed his older brother from behind and asked if he was really going to kill him. Boris was sitting on his older brother's back. He was very scared. He didn't understand why he was doing this, because at that moment he didn't look like himself. Boris wanted only one thing: for his older brother to wake up. Evgen's eyes were becoming more and more red. There was nothing human in them. At that moment Boris jumped up and realized that it was a dream again, but it was so true that it seemed to him that it was all real. Boris looked at his older brother and did not understand what it was. He was barely breathing. At that moment Evgen asked him if he had had a nightmare. Boris had nothing to say. He sat silently and looked at his older brother. In front of Dari himself was his brother. He stood and looked at him. Well, for some reason Boris saw in his older brother the same man with red eyes who had strangled him that night. Boris thought for a bit and decided that it seemed to him because it was just a dream. So somehow he got out of the situation by saying that he just didn't sleep well. Evgen, seeing that Boris was holding the lock, asked him what had happened. Was it really painful? Boris didn't say anything because he remembered how his brother held him by the throat with his hands. And then he threw it aside so that it fell on the floor and hit itself, which is why it hurts now. Boris realized that he had not dreamed it at all, that it happened to him, because the pain was real. But Boris didn't tell what happened. He said that he just fell out of bed in his sleep. His older brother didn't believe it because it wasn't like him. He said that most likely the last few days had apparently worn him out. Evgen added that if they had a good rest yesterday, he suggested that they immediately continue their journey today. Boris did not resist. After some time, and not just the two of them, they set off on their journey further. Boris walked behind his older brother. The whole time they were walking, they practically didn't talk about anything. Boris watched his older brother take steps. He walked behind and looked at his back. The younger brother wanted to understand what happened. He wanted to figure everything out. Boris walked behind thinking about what happened yesterday. He clearly saw his brother attack him. It was not a dream and not an illusion. The only thing he understood was that his brother was doing it in a foggy mind. His hands were hot and sticky while he was strangling him, as if he was overcome by a fever. And the most important thing is that his older brother seems to have no memory of what happened, but he is still hiding something from him. Boris couldn't stand it and asked his older brother if he was okay. His older brother continued on his way. Yevgeny didn't immediately say, but he smiled a little that everything was fine with him. Then, for some reason, he started walking very quickly so that his younger brother could barely keep up with him. At that moment, Boris realized he was absolutely sure that his older brother was sick, but he continued to walk without being able to ask for help. For some reason, he thought that they were probably heading to Granny Janine's house. And if that was the case, then his older brother would be able to handle the journey. Boris thought maybe they really had no one to rely on, so he stopped and decided to ask his older brother. After all, in reality, their father most likely won't come to meet them again. Evgen stopped, turned his head back, and tried to answer something. The older brother didn't want to upset his younger brother. He said that no, it's not like that at all. Boris asked him to answer honestly. Boris demanded his older brother to tell him what happened. He asked if their father was their uncle. Evgen stopped his younger brother. He didn't know how to explain it to him, but he understood that he couldn't remain silent any longer. So he asked his younger brother for a minute to wait. Boris thought something was wrong. Boris vaguely remembered the monster that tried to swallow their estate and the ghost of the lake. Well, everything that happened next was like in a fog. He wanted to know what happened. He remembered only one thing, that he ran for a long time, and remembered how the ground was slipping out from under his feet. At some point he was very scared because he saw something on Lake Ara, but he doesn't remember it. Boris thought that at that moment something most likely happened to their father. His older brother said that he was right. At that moment Evgen lowered his head and also told about how their father would never come because some time ago something irreparable happened. Boris assumed this, but he still wasn't ready to hear it. It was too hard for him. His older brother said that their father went to a place where there was no way out and told everything that happened on the lake. He then added that the butler was now with their father, so their father would be fine. Boris remembered all the events that were erased from his memory. Now everything became clear to him. The boy stood there a little shocked because he found out something he didn't want to hear at all. His older brother called him very loudly and told him to be careful. Boris did not understand what had happened. The next moment, a huge paw of a monster appeared in front of the boy. It was so big and ugly that he got scared. When he raised his eyes, he saw a huge monster approaching him. This monster was so close to Boris that he didn't know what to do. He had a dagger in his hands, but he was still scared. Boris stood and looked at this huge monster in front of him. This monster had huge red eyes, exactly like the monster on the lake. Boris stood looking up at him and couldn't even move. Boris looked straight into the eyes of this huge monster. He understood that he was too small to fight him. The monster looked at him with its red eyes and was ready to destroy him in a matter of seconds. The sword fell out of the boy's hands. He couldn't hold it. He was so scared. The monster tried to get as close as possible to the boy Boris with its tentacles and sharp claws and fell to the ground. Boris narrowed his eyes in fear. He was afraid to even open them to see this monster in front of him. He felt his older brother reach out to him and tell him to grab it. Boris couldn't do it, so his older brother grabbed him by the collar and dragged him towards him. The elder brother threw him to a safe distance, and Boris found himself behind his elder brother. When he opened his eyes, he saw that Evgen was standing in front of him, demanding that Boris run away as quickly as possible. Boris could only open one eye. He was afraid to even look at this monster and everything that was happening. But he saw how this bridge was approaching his older brother and was ready to attack him. Blood splashed right on Boris's face. He did not understand what had happened to his brother. That moment when Boris heard his brother screaming for him to run, he stood frozen and looked at this monster. At that moment, the boy realized that it would be the same ghost that he had heard since childhood. The same ghost that his nanny told him about, that a ghost with red eyes lives on Lake Ara. At that moment, he realized that this ghost looked undead, not dead. The only thing that surprised him was that the eyes of this ghost were red fire. At that moment, when this ghost swung his huge wing at his brother, Boris got very scared and ran away like a real coward. He didn't even look back. He ran and thought only about one thing: what could happen to his brother, because he left him there all alone with this monster. Boris could not forgive himself for being so scared and attacking the iron. He understood perfectly well that his older brother was left alone with this monster and took the full brunt of the blow, saving him. After some time they met again and sat by the fire as before. This time his older brother was not so cheerful and did not try to calm his younger brother down. Boris also looked at the fire all the time. You understand that their relationship has changed a lot. Suddenly the elder brother said that tomorrow at dawn everyone should go their own way. Boris was very surprised that it meant that everyone would go their own way rather than his older brother deciding to quit. Evgen told his younger brother that it would be better if they said goodbye, and then added that he could no longer be there. He had little time left. After these words which Boris did not understand, he wondered what it could mean, that there was little time and where he was in a hurry. Boris only had questions left, and he hasn't heard an answer from his older brother yet. Boris lowered his head down and then said that no, he doesn't want it like that. Boris did not raise his head, but he told his older brother that he would be with him until the very end. Evgen then told his younger brother if the attack that he had last night happens again, then he could kill him. He should have understood that. Then the older brother said that it was the ghost of Emmer with red eyes that took their aunt's life. She was always kind and gentle, and he remembered it very well, but when he returned from that lake, there was no trace of her former self left. I read madness in her eyes, and no one close to her recognized her anymore. Her voice became like a monster's. It was very scary, and there was no way to change it. The most terrible thing was that only death could cure their aunt. There was no other way out. Evgen was very worried that the same thing that happened to their aunt would happen to him. Then the older brother told Boris to take Winterer, pull it out of the knife and try to swing it. The boy didn't understand why he needed it, but he fulfilled the request of his elder brother and took this sword into his hands. It will be hard for him. Boris held this sword with both hands, but it was difficult for him. He still didn't give in to him, so it was hard for the boy, and his older brother helped him. Evgen said if only he was a little older, then most likely he would have succeeded the first time. Evgen was very sorry because he couldn't wait until his younger brother grew up enough to hold this sword. And most importantly, he was offended that he would not be able to see how his younger brother could defend himself. Evgen took a few steps back. He understood perfectly well that his younger brother would not be able to grow up in an instant. He also understood perfectly well that his time was running out and monsters were appearing in his body that he could not cope with. Evgen told his younger brother that he would most likely hurt him soon enough. Boris looked at him with huge eyes and did not understand what his brother was talking about. He certainly did not expect such a turn of events. Boris thought he had the impression that his brother was leaving him right now. He tried to mentally tell him not to go away here, not to leave him alone. Boris shouted to his older brother that he absolutely didn't care if he killed him. He was ready to stay with him until the end. Tears ran down Boris's cheeks. He screamed that he knew what his older brother was thinking, but he couldn't survive without him. Boris understood that there were many people hunting for Winterer, and they could not be more dangerous than those they had encountered so far. That's why the younger brother said that he wants to be with his brother until the very end, no matter what, because dying at his hand won't be so scary. These words upset the older brother very much. He could not answer him. He only nodded his head. And then he deliberately hit his younger brother in the face with his palm so that it would hurt him a lot. Boris didn't understand why he got this blow. He was offended because he had just said that he was very devoted to his brother. Evgen said in a stern voice, did his younger brother really forget their conversation, and should he repeat what he told him? Boris became even more upset. Tears were streaming down his face. He only managed to wipe them away with his hand. Boris raised his head and through tears began to say that his older brother then said that he needed to survive. Evgen repeated to him that he remembered everything correctly, and he doesn't even have the right to die. When he disappears, Boris must become very strong. And then hugging his younger brother, Evgen said that he himself must become a shield no matter what, because he won't be able to hide behind someone's back anymore, because he will be himself. The older brother also added that Boris should not trust anyone, and in no case should he lose his vigilance. It will be difficult, but it will be worth it. He needs all this for only one purpose, because it is about survival, and he must do this in order to learn all the possibilities that life holds. Boris stood silently, tears streaming from his eyes, and he looked at his older brother, listening to every word he said. Then Evgen picked up from the ground a sword that was a relic in the family, and he handed this sword to his younger brother and said that from that moment on this sword was his. Boris understood what responsibility lay on him and why his older brother was doing this. Evgen added that if he loses his mind again at some point, his younger brother should use it to kill him. Evgen caught himself thinking that his memories were gradually dissipating and he didn't remember at all what he had done. It seemed to him that he was going crazy, forgetting like a monster how it was with his aunt. It seemed to him that everything was happening to him exactly the same way as to her. He was tormented by only one question: did he threaten the life of his younger brother? At some point it seemed to him that morning had come, but when he came to his senses it was already noon. He lit a fire at sunset, and when he looked up, the stars lit up the sky. Evgen caught herself thinking that he can't control anything and he's losing himself. Various thoughts were creeping into his head, and they were quite bad. For some reason he thought that he could harm his younger brother, and he was afraid to wake up one day and see his bloody body lying right in front of him. While he was thinking about all this, the sun had already appeared from behind the mountains and illuminated the surrounding area. Boris was not sleeping at this time. He went to collect brushwood and keep their fire burning. When the younger brother approached, he saw his older brother sitting near the tree. Boris told his older brother that he should at least get some sleep because he hadn't closed his eyes for 3 days. Evgen really wanted to sleep. His eyelids were drooping, but he couldn't allow himself to do that hadn't he really slept for 3 days. Boris didn't understand what would happen next. He decided to put the brushwood in one pile and make a fire. At that moment he saw his older brother stretch out his hand in which he held Snowguard. Evgen told his younger brother that he took it because he no longer needed it. Boris was indignant because he believed that this thing belonged to his older brother. To which Evgen replied, "What use is armor to a dead man?" Boris took the armor into his hands, realizing that he now owned all the relics of their family. Evgen told his younger brother to promise him something, that he would never look for anything together. He explained that for a long time members of the Trevich family had been destroying each other on political dimensions, and if at least one of them had let go of the offense or decided to forgive the other subscriber, this tragedy would not have happened. Their father and uncle entered the battle, but it was the ghost with red eyes that took the father's life, so he hoped that Boris would not find out and the discord that would be in the family, and this discord would never touch him. The older brother said that he will see and experience many new things until he grows up. And then he added that when this happens he wants his younger brother to forget his childhood, or most likely for him to forgive him and let him go. It was getting darker and darker outside, and it was time for bed. Boris couldn't stand it, and his older brother was the first to fall asleep, as before he sat near the tree trying not to fall asleep. Evgen opened his eyes very damply, looked at the fire, and thought so that he wouldn't fall asleep that night either. His eyelids were getting heavier and heavier. He couldn't fight sleep, but he thought he shouldn't fall asleep. He clearly understood that if he fell asleep anything could happen. At some point he heard a voice very familiar to him. This voice asked him what he was doing there, and called him to them in the distance. He saw the silhouette of his parents, who said that they were waiting for him. When morning came, Boris approached his older brother and saw that he was fast asleep. Boris told his older brother to get some sleep because he was doing well, because he needed to rest. His older brother's eyes were closed. It was clear that he couldn't stay awake for so long. At some point when Boris turned away, his brother's eyes opened. Evgen could see his younger brother walking somewhere to the side, but he didn't say anything. Then he saw his younger brother Layak somewhere nearby and also decided to sleep with him. The younger brother covered his older brother with a blanket so that he wouldn't freeze and could get some sleep. Evgen lay silently, understanding that an attack could happen to him at any moment and he would not be able to control it. He looked at the sky, thinking only about one thing, that he could do good for his little brother after he left. At that moment he saw several flashes in the sky, and it surprised him very much. Evgen rose to look at the meteor shower that was happening that night. Then he stood and looked at the sky for some time without taking his eyes off it. At that moment Evgen realized what he could do for his younger brother. He now knew for sure. At that moment Evgen calmed down a little. He wasn't afraid for his younger brother like before. He thought it was time for him to take a nap after hard days. Even the falling stars were kicking their mother under his side. Evgen wanted his younger brother not to worry and sleep peacefully because he would protect his sleep. He knew that no one would disturb him, and Boris would wake up and see everything that happened that night. When Boris woke up, he really saw that in the place where his brother was supposed to sleep there was a huge hole. Boris was a little scared. I don't understand what happened, but he had no choice but to look, so he came closer. Evgen always told his younger brother that even if the dark night would frighten him, he should not be afraid because the morning would soon come, and that he should forget all the hardships and not shed tears. Boris walked to the edge of this huge hole to see what was inside. It was then that his older brother, forgive me, said that he wanted to kiss him goodbye. In that hole was his older brother. He was lying in a pool of blood. He was dead. Despite what Boris saw, he remembered his older brother's last words, that he would always remain with him. Boris looked at his older brother and thought that he once told him that if he had a happy dream, the night would fly by in an instant. When Evgen woke up that night, he saw stars falling from the sky, and then he made a decision for himself, that he should do the same as these falling stars. He dug a huge hole with his own hands because he thought he had very little time left. Then he went up to his little brother again, kissed him, covered him with a blanket, and decided that this had to be finished. He sat on his knees for a while, saying goodbye to his younger brother, the only thing that connected him to life. He looked at Boris as he slept soundly and understood that he was shifting all responsibility onto his shoulders, but in no case could he allow anyone to harm him. Boris continued to sleep soundly near the fire he had made himself. His older brother threw a few twigs into the fire so that it wouldn't go out until the morning. Then I looked at my younger brother again, worried that everything would be okay with him because he was saying goodbye to him. He came closer to cover him so that he would never wake up until the morning. Evgen wanted to never forget the look his younger brother always gave him. Then the elder brother went who from Miami, which he dug. Boris saw his older brother in his dream and muttered, but then closed his eyes and continued to sleep. His older brother anchored the sword at the bottom of the hole he dug. Then he became so that he would fall into this hole just as stars fall from the sky right onto the sword, so that there would not be a single sun to survive. So he stood there for a few seconds saying goodbye to this life because he was leaving forever to his parents. Evgen clearly understood what he was doing and what was happening, but he couldn't not do it. So he closed his eyes and like a star in the sky he fell down. He didn't make a single sound so as not to wake up his younger brother. The only ones who heard about all this were the vultures that were circling around the dead body, and they were the ones who woke up Boris. Boris came to the edge of this as me and saw that his older brother was lying below. Near the dead body of the elder brother lay the same sword that was covered in blood. At that moment Boris realized that in this life he was left alone and now he had no one to rely on. With this understanding he fell to his knees in front of the hole in which his older brother lay. Boris thought that most likely his older brother dug his own grave with his own hands. He looked at his body and could not come to his senses. Tears flowed down his cheeks. He realized that his brother had thrown off Winter's blades, and then he used his last strength to pull it out of his body. Boris cried and did not understand why his older brother did not leave him the slightest chance to save him. Boris went down to his older brother and put on him the armor that belonged to him and put the sword next to him. Boris didn't understand why he died because he didn't even have time to live for himself. Then he started throwing earth at his older brother. After some time he completely covered him with earth and separated him. He understood that he would never see him again. The only thing Boris could say was that his older brother was sleeping peacefully. And Boris stood for some time near the grave of his older brother, but he understood that he needed to move on. He took the sword that belonged to him and left the armor to his brother. This sword Boris turned around and went on his way. I don't know what will happen to him tomorrow. The next morning in one of the settlements that were on the young man's way, everything was as usual. Except for one house where the girl couldn't figure out what to wear this morning. She was swearing because she thought all her things were three. Her assistant said that they are not in the village, so clothes for noble persons like her owner are sewn only to order. The girl told her assistant to find her clothes elsewhere. She would not wear a maid's dress. The assistant said that other places would offer the same thing. The assistant didn't know what to do because her mistress was very upset, but she thought that it was not her fault at all that their luggage fell out of the carriage and all the things ended up in the mud, and the young lady as always took out her anger on her. The assistant thought that it was Trevage and not Anamarad. She did not understand where her young mistress was offering to get the dress. She walked down the street and thought that no matter where she looked there was no shop she needed. She had already decided that maybe she should look for a dressmaker. Someone started shouting so that everyone would look at the boy. The assistant turned her head towards the same boy who was walking along the street and holding a huge sword in his hands. People did not understand why the young boy was wandering around alone in such a sloppy state, and everyone wanted to know what kind of sword he was holding in his hands. The sword was really beautiful and made an impression on those around, and most importantly it shines very brightly. The assistant looked at this boy and thought that it was incredible, but he was her peer, so it was unclear where he got such a solid sword from. The assistant thought that this boy looked very tired. She was interested in this guy and she wondered where he was going. After watching this guy, she saw that he approached one of the houses and was ready to open the door. The assistant realized that it looked like an inn. She couldn't stand it and shouted at the guy to wait. She told him that he couldn't just go there and that it was dangerous. You never know what kind of bandits might be in such an unsightly place. Boris looked at the girl who tried to stop him, but he was so tired that he couldn't even object to her. He only answered her that everything was fine. The assistant did not understand why he was behaving this way and why he had such a gloomy expression on his face. Even at some point she showed that it was as if a shadow had fallen on this guy and he did not belong to himself. Boris did not stop. He opened the door, stood in the yard, and took a few steps inside. When he entered, he asked if he could go inside. He was greeted by a girl standing behind the fence who said, "Yes, come in." Boris asked the girl if he could have a room, and as soon as possible the girl was a little surprised. She asked him just in case, to which he replied that yes. She asked if he wanted a cheaper room, in which case he would owe her 5 in silver. The girl explained that this room is located in the back. The bed is a bit small, but she thinks it will suit him. Boris looked around, thought for a bit, and then looked at the owner of this establishment. He told her that the girl smiled and didn't understand what else he needed. Boris lowered his eyes and asked the girl if she knew anyone who could give him a job. He looked up and replied that he didn't need money, he just needed food and a roof over his head. That's all he wanted. He remembered the words of his brother, who told him that in order to survive he must be strong and endure this harsh winter. Boris repeated once again to the owner of this establishment that he doesn't need money, only food. She looked at the boy a little surprised and thought that he was talking like an adult, although she was still just a child. She looked at him and thought what kind of work would suit him, what could she offer him. Then the girl said that she couldn't say for sure, but she thought that some of the local merchants might need an assistant to carry out an order, or some rich lady might want to hire him as a servant. At that moment someone raised his hand and called the girl over to serve him. It was a huge man who asked the girl to bring more beer. It was Bunin the blacksmith. The girl told him to wait a minute, then told Boris to look at this man. It was the gentleman who owned the Martins. And then she added that this gentleman is just looking for a helper, so this is a good opportunity. The guy just needs to come up with her and ask him. Then the girl said that, by the way, her name was Tanya, and she was the innkeeper's daughter. Boris answered dryly what his name was. He didn't want to introduce himself further, so that no one would know who he was. When they approached the gentleman and asked about the work, he said that the guy looked rather puny and didn't know if he could handle blacksmithing. Boris answered him honestly that he didn't even know what kind of work it was. That gentleman really liked the fact that this guy at least didn't deceive him and admitted honestly. Then the gentleman added that he immediately understood that the young men were of new origin from some family, most likely there was an internecine war. Boris said nothing. The blacksmith thought to himself that he had supplied weapons for such cases several times already. These internecine wars boil down to the powerful killing each other for profit. And if this boy really became a victim of such a conflict, then it is understandable why he has such a gloomy look. The gentleman asked the boy if he probably didn't want to talk about it. Boris remained silent. The blacksmith loudly put the mug on the table so that he asked and said that he did not insist on being told everything. Then the master told the boy to come to the forge tomorrow morning. He would give him work, but if he couldn't handle it, he would send him away. At that moment Tanya came up and asked Boris if they had really decided everything so quickly. It was a relief for her, and she said that he had quickly thanked the gentleman. He lowered his head down and looked only at the table. He didn't know if it was good or bad, but he did it. It was already getting dark outside, and there were practically no people. Night was falling. The girl brought a tray with a plate of food on it. She asked the boy because he hadn't had dinner yet, and it was a special dish from their tavern. The girl told Boris to eat faster before it gets cold. Boris continued to sit at the table in front of him. He really hadn't eaten for a long time. Tanya told the young gentleman that he really should get into the habit of saying thank you when he is helped. Boris raised his eyes and looked at the girl. He really didn't say thank you, and the next moment he immediately thanked her. The girl turned around, looked at the guy again, and walked on. She told him to rest. After just a few minutes, the plate the girl brought was empty. Boris was really hungry. He immediately lay down on the bed that was in his room. He needed to rest because tomorrow morning he would already be going to work. Boris lay on the bed. He understood perfectly well that blacksmiths make agricultural tools and weapons, so the work would be hard. He remembered the blacksmith who hired him for work and remembered his words because he would be waiting for him tomorrow morning. He lay on the bed and thought about everything. He was worried about something else. Could he trust these people? After all, he had encountered it more than once recently, and then they understood that people are different. Even those whom they considered good people in difficult times, they passed them on to their brother. And the fact that she saved their lives, stole the sword, and sold them to a gang of mercenaries. He suddenly thought that Tanya and this gentleman were also planning something terrible. The only conclusion that Boris made was that the Kinder people are, the dirtier their plans are, and that he needs to check whether the Martin actually exists. And most importantly, he decided to check whether the blacksmith was trustworthy, so he decided to quietly leave this tavern and check everything. She took a few steps on the street and heard a loud stomping sound. Someone was shouting at his horse, but she went. Along this street, two young men on horses were racing. They were shouting to all the passers-by to get out of the way. Boris was crossing the road at that moment. These guys were shouting at him. Is he really deaf? But the boy seemed not to hear. One of these riders shouted at him to get out if he didn't want to die. The horse reared up. Boris was very scared when he saw that the horse was very close to him. He was afraid that her front hooves were very close and she could hit him. This is what happened. The next moment the horse hit the boy on the head with one of its hooves. Boris couldn't stay on his feet and fell to the ground, hitting himself even harder. The rider on this horse stopped and asked the guy why the hell he didn't leave the road or if he was looking for death. And then he added that if he blocked their path he should bow down and ask for forgiveness and not stare. This rider thought that he was a small beggar and did not know manners. None of the people helped the boy. Everyone turned away and pretended as if nothing had happened. Boris had no choice but to raise his head and ask forgiveness from the gentleman who was sitting there for disturbing him. But then Boris said that he thought it was wrong to ride a horse where there were a lot of people walking. This gentleman jumped off his horse and said that this boy was not one to mince words, and his friend added that it looked like he needed to be taught a lesson. The rider who ran over Boris swung his arm to hit him and said that was exactly what he was going to do. He swung the sword that hit his horse, and he also wanted to hit the young gentleman. I couldn't do anything and I couldn't dodge, so this gentleman's blow hit me straight on the club. After one blow he hit Boris several more times while saying that this is what happens to steam who gets in the way of their feet. The officer who was riding the horse asked the boy after he had given him several blows with the whip if he had understood that it was wrong to do that. Boris was very offended because in fact he had not done anything wrong and had simply made a remark to them. At that moment he squeezed the sword he had with all his might. He thought if he was strong enough to wield that sword or his older brother would be here. But the next moment Boris realized that all these thoughts would not help him in any way. Now he had to do everything himself. The rider demanded that the boy, if he understood everything, ask him for forgiveness. They stood for a while, but Boris was not going to ask for forgiveness. He was thinking about what to do. Boris thought that he had to get up on his knees and stand on two legs. Anyway, he couldn't humiliate himself in front of his enemy. The rider said that this guy was a scoundrel. Boris understood that now he was alone in this world. His older brother gave his life to save him, and he would not allow some scoundrels to break him. It was at this time, in another part of this settlement, that the young lady's assistant returned to the estate. The young lady was very upset. She thought it was just funny. Couldn't she find a single tailor? She didn't understand what the nobles wore here. It was Rosalind de Bellner, the only daughter of Count Bellner. Her assistant asked the lady for forgiveness because she could not find a place where they sew dresses to order. She said that even the sewing workshop was nowhere to be seen on the road. She met only that boy as she showed him he needed help. At that moment a knock on the door was heard. Someone asked permission to come in. It was the young lady's father. She said that her father could come in. When her father came in, he had a dress in his hands. He bought his daughter a new dress. The young lady was very happy. She thanked her tutu and said that he was better. The gentleman asked his daughter to get dressed quickly because he wanted to take a walk through the evening city with his daughter. And then he added that studying the customs and traditions of other lands would allow her to become wiser. The girl agreed. They were already waiting for her on the street, and one of the horses was intended for her father and the young lady. When they went on this walk, the girl tried to find out where her father got this beautiful dress. She was curious because her assistant Kamaya searched the entire city but found no one. Her father said that he bought the dress that was sewn for another girl. The young lady was surprised that it is not customary for local noblewomen to wear a dress. Her father said that there were no nobles in this city, and this worried his daughter a little. He then asked one of his assistants to look after his daughter Rosa. At that moment his father left her alone with an assistant and rode off further. In just a few minutes he was at the very spot where one of the horses had hit the boy, and then the rider had hit him with the fence several more times. The gentleman approached them and wanted to clarify what had happened there. He saw a little boy lying on the ground hugging a sword tightly in his hands. People are talking among themselves about how finally someone has stopped and someone will be able to help him. Are they really going to fight with swords? When Tanya went outside, she screamed loudly and called for the blacksmith to come out as quickly as possible. The gentleman who rode up on the horse wanted to know what happened, so he asked about it. In response, he heard that they did not understand who he was to interfere, and incomprehensible laughter. This gentleman told the boy's offenders that they were mocking a defenseless child and that they should get lost. These offenders did not understand why he was happy, but the gentleman also told them that they would regret not running away immediately. One of the offenders asked if they really had a knight of justice, and taking out his sword he rode off on horseback to strike the master. Only the gentleman was so serious that he understood that he could deal with these guys very quickly. That's exactly how it happened. He jumped off his horse to stop the offender. The very next moment nothing remained of the offender, who was confident in his strength. He looked at the master and asked him for mercy. The sword that was in the hands of the offender was in the ground. He was completely disarmed. The gentleman stood right in front of him and asked if he wanted to continue holding the sword in his hands. This sword was right next to his throat. Just one move and this offender could lose his head. So these guys who were just bullying Boris decided that they shouldn't mess with him and they needed to run away as fast as possible. The gentleman immediately ordered his assistants to search for a doctor in the area as quickly as possible. Tanya pointed her finger to the side and said that in the third house in that alley there is a pharmacist who can help the boy. After some time the gentleman's daughter drove up to this place and she screamed. Her father asked if she was scared. She shouldn't worry, everything was fine now. He always told her that anyone who sees injustice being committed and passes by does not deserve the title of nobleman. Boris continued to sit on the ground holding his sword tightly in his hands. The gentleman told his daughter, so that she would remember his words. Rose looked at the boy with her huge green eyes, the same as her new dress, and she answered her father that she knew everything but she still didn't like dirty people like him. When Boris opened his eyes the next day, he saw that the sun was shining brightly right into his window. He was a little confused. It was hard for him to turn his head after yesterday's blow. The first thought that came to his mind was where he saw a flower on the wallpaper. He thought it was his mother's room. He began to feel everything around him and could not understand where his sword was. Boris raised his head, sat on the bed, and shouted loudly the sword he had to. He saw a nanny next to him who most likely looked after him all night. The nanny told him that the sword he was looking for was under the bed. Then Boris asked this woman where he was. She told him not to move because she needed to look at his wounds. This woman wanted to know where this boy's house was. Boris answered her that he didn't have a house. The woman didn't understand whether he was a tramp, but he didn't look like one at all. Boris replied that he still can't go back to what is called his home, so it can be considered that he doesn't have one. This woman looked at the boy and asked if maybe he accidentally became a tragic hero of one of the books. That's what fugitives say who don't realize how comfortable it is to live at home. In fact, the Count saved him out of the kindness of his soul, but there is no point in causing him any more inconvenience, and he should return to his family. Boris asked if it was really the Count, to which the woman replied that Count Bellner had interceded for him. The Count arrived from Manhwa. At that moment the young lady's assistant came in. She was glad that he had woken up and brought him clean things. The girl came closer to him, bent down and looked at him and again. Then she said that she had already told him that he shouldn't have gone to that tavern. He was incredibly lucky that the gentleman was passing by. Boris didn't understand who it was. The assistant held his clothes already washed and ironed so that he could wear them again. The assistant asked him how he was feeling and if he could move after yesterday. And then she added that the Count had invited him to dinner, so he should get dressed and go out. They were waiting for him. At the head of the table sat the Count, who immediately saw the boy and greeted him. Then he said that he was very glad that Boris had woken up and was ready to walk. Boris thought it was a man, most likely he was the savior, and this was Count Bellner. Boris looked at the table and got an appetite. There were many products there that he hadn't seen for a long time. They sat him down and gave him a plate of food. The Count told the boy to try one of the dishes. He was interested in whether he knew the real taste of Belarusian. The Count's daughter said that it was an omelette with truffles. Their family is famous for these mushrooms. The Count added that the boy was most likely very hungry, so let him eat rather than be shy. Boris thought that he had not had a proper dinner for a long time since the moment he left his house. Of course, he first tried their signature dish, an omelette with truffles. When he ate, he remembered the time when he lived with his father and his older brother on the estate. The Count said, looking at the boy, that it seemed to him that he liked her. Then after dinner the Count said that he wanted to introduce himself if the young man did not mind. He said that he is Count Bellner from Belcruz, located in the south of the kingdom of Amamarad, and his name is Ganymede de Bellner. Then he looked at the young lady and said that this was his heiress and only daughter Rosalind de Bellner. At that moment Boris realized that it was his turn. He didn't know what to say, and he decided that it was worth telling the truth, he said that he was Boris Zenaman. He hoped that this count was from other lands, so it was unlikely that he would know about his family. The count lowered his head and eyes when he heard what family he was from. Then he asked the boy again if he was from the Zenaman family from Long Ord. Boris realized that this count knew everything. The count began to say that we have heard about this family of brave warriors from Trevaz and know that they got into trouble. Boris started talking about how his father was dying and his uncle became the head of the family. In that case, the count said he assumed that their views on governance differed. He asked where he was heading next. He doubted that the boy would be able to return home. Boris said that he himself doesn't know yet where he's going because he's left alone. Then he said that one blacksmith offered him a job and perhaps he would stay with him. The count asked again if he really wanted to take up blacksmithing and was sure that he would like this work. Boris said that he doesn't know, but he will try to love her because he has no other choice. The count remained silent. Then, after waiting a bit, the count said that he had a proposal. He asked the boy if he wanted to go to a namarad. At that moment, he took the glass in his hands. Boris turned his head and looked at the count. He didn't expect to hear such a proposal. The young lady was a little worried. She didn't know whether this guy would go with them. The count replied that it was up to Boris to decide. I just gave him something to think about. Boris asked the count why he was making him such a generous offer. The young lady was furious. The count said that he could of course tell why he made this proposal, but he would prefer not to do so. Boris insisted that he answer him. He thought if this man has a reason, then he wants to know it. The count thought for a moment and said okay, he's ready to name this reason. Then he said that he would like to use the young master for his own interests. Boris was upset because he knew that no matter who he met and who helped him, it was not from good intentions. The count said that he doesn't need anything, so it's not quite as Boris might think. And then he continued that he has a beautiful daughter and he does not intend to have more children, but he needs a child his age. He explained that long before his daughter was born, he made a bet with a friend. At that moment they vowed that when their children turned 13, they would meet side by side, but the one who lost would grant any wish of the winner. Very soon after this, the couple had a daughter, Rosa, and he completely forgot about this bet. And last year he heard news about his friend, with whom he had not spoken for ages. It turned out that he had 2 boys, but unfortunately the eldest son was born mentally retarded. As soon as he learned that the count had a daughter, he began training his youngest son to make him an outstanding swordsman. So he plans to win the bet and marry his son to Rosalind, which he didn't really want. At that moment the young lady dropped the cup she was holding from her hands and screamed, "What the hell is this?" Then she asked her father again if it was true. Her huge eyes became even bigger. She wanted to clarify if she would have to marry a mentally retarded person. The count told his daughter to calm down, and he swore on his honor that he would never allow this to happen. Boris asked the count again if he really had enough saving ability to distance this guy. Besides, he was not his son. The count said that he would say that he had installed him and raised him on other lands, and now he decided to take him home, and they would treat him like his own son, and if he wins, then they promise that he will give him a solid reward and make sure that he doesn't need anything else. And if he loses, he won't punish him in any way, he'll just ask him to leave his house. Boris wanted to know why him. After all, he was an ordinary passerby, whom he accidentally saved. After all, he knows nothing at all about him. The count said that the boy had nowhere to go anyway, which is true. He could hire at least 10 children, but finding a boy of noble birth is not so easy. He then said that as soon as they returned to Anamarad, he would immediately have to live the role of his adopted son. He did not have time to teach anyone etiquette and traditions. He said that the Zenaman family is one of the most famous Mechnik families, and it becomes clear that the boy definitely inherited the talent of the facto Niu. At that moment, he looked at the sword that was near Boris. The count wanted to ask him what he would say about all this. He wanted to know if he would accept his proposal. Boris sat silently for a while and needed to think about everything that had just happened. He thought that if he went to the blacksmith, a peaceful and quiet life would await him. And if he works with a blacksmith, then hiding his identity won't be that difficult. And if he leaves for the distant kingdom of Anamarad, he will have to face new difficulties and trials. But there was one positive thing in all this. This was the only way he could leave Trevage, the very land where his father and brother died. He can go to the land that brought him suffering and took away too much, so his choice was clear. He really wanted to leave this country, and so he accepted the count's offer. The next day they set off on a long journey. He said goodbye to the country that was for him a stain of blood. But he made his choice to become stronger and survive as his older brother asked him to. He clearly remembered his words when he said that he had to live for the sake of his life. he committed suicide. They set off on their way. The real mountain road was moving in a caravan, several of these types. In one of these carriages sat Boris with a young lady and her assistant. They sat in silence, each looking at his own side. In the boy's hands was his sword with which he never parted. And the young lady looked at Boris and thought that he was always silent. He was so boring for her. Without thinking twice, she turned to her assistant and asked who she thought was older. Kamaya smiled and said that she didn't even know. Rosalind told the young man to look at her. When Boris turned around, she asked him if he was really 12, but she also didn't understand which of them would be the younger one. The young lady thought that maybe she could get this silent boy to bet on it so that the ride would be more fun. Boris answered her very calmly that he didn't care, let her think as she wanted. He said if she wants, then let her be the older sister. The girl was indignant because she couldn't even imagine such a thing. The young lady thought that this guy gave up very quickly, so she told him that this couldn't be. She asked when his birthday was because hers was in April. Boris looked at her and said that his birthday was July 12th. Rosalind was a little upset because she thought he was just a boring guy. Boris had nothing to say. Then he thought for a bit and said, okay, so be it, he will be the eldest. These words made Rosalind even more angry. She thought after all she hadn't meant to do this from the very beginning. She asked again if he really thought she wanted to be the youngest. The main thing here was that they would be a family from now on. After some time they arrived at the estate where the Count lived with his family. Rosalind immediately got out of the carriage because of the screaming, and seeing her mother she ran towards her. Her mother stood there not showing any emotion. The girl ran to her shouting that they were back. Her mother also continued to stand and watch as her daughter approached her. When the girl ran very close to her mother said that she asked her not to run in a dress. At that moment Boris, getting out of the carriage, thought that this was a very bright and light place. Now it seems that he really should like it here because he is far from home. At that moment he thought that most likely no one here knew him, and this calmed him down. The Countess asked the Count when he approached if this was the same boy. The Count answered yes. Then he said that they had come a long way and suggested going inside to finish their acquaintance, where the Countess agreed with him. Boris stood near the crew for some time. The assistants unloaded, but he continued to stand. The estate was indeed very huge, but he liked it. Once inside, they gathered in one of the rooms to get to know each other better. There was a cup in front of Boris. He moved it closer to himself to take a few sips. The Countess said that she had received the letter and had a general idea of what had happened. She told the boy to make himself at home. Their daughter intervened in the conversation and said that she always dreamed of having an older brother, so she decided to be his younger sister. The Count laughed and said that they became very close very quickly, so it was very good for their family. Then the Count said that Boris should now call him Dad and the Countess Mom, so that everything would be true. And the most important thing is that he must remember what he just told him, that he was the youngest son of Elgudin Pasha, Lord of Gwansk of the western lands of Trevich. He should remember that he was adopted at the age of 5 because his family lived well together and he received financial support from them, but at the same time he grew up with his father because his mother passed away early. And then when his father died unexpectedly, he moved to the Bellner estate where he lives now. GRA asked Boris if he remembered everything. Then he said that there are those in the place who are aware of his situation. There were 2 people, the Count's secretary who arrived with his daughter when all this happened, and the woman who was looking after him, and also the young lady's assistant and the guards who were with him when he helped the boy. Well, even they don't know all the details because these details are known only to the Count, his wife, and his daughter. That is why Boris had to stick to the legend that the Count had just told him. He asked again if he had understood everything. Boris answered without hesitation that yes, of course it was a made-up story, but there was still something in common with his situation. The Count ordered the servants to prepare a room for Boris, and this room should preferably be close to his daughter. If this is so, then it should have been ideal. That's what the Count thought. He said that they should prepare that room on the 2nd floor of the Moon Tower. The Countess listened to all her husband's wishes and said that she agreed with him. The young lady was a little surprised. She couldn't even imagine that he would offer Boris a party room. The Count said he would also find a mentor who would teach him ball control, but he could rest until then because the trip had been difficult. The Count also asked his daughter to give him a tour of the estate, as the estate was quite large, and he didn't want Boris to get lost. The young lady asked her father if Boris would need a servant. Her father answered that she should take care of her older brother, and tomorrow he will introduce servants to Boris so that the boy will be able to choose his own assistant. Boris caught himself thinking that the Count really treated him like a son, even he didn't remember his father ever smiling at him with such warmth. Boris looked at the room he found himself in. He liked everything here very much. It was quite sunny. He was finally left alone. He needed to think about the recent events and relive it all again. He had been through so much lately that he couldn't even believe that he would be able to live in a good home again. Just a few minutes ago his new adopted sister said that tomorrow she would show him the room he would live in, and today he would rest in the guest bedroom. Boris thought maybe even better than his room in his estate. Do they really keep it clean all the time so that an unexpected guest could stay here? He looked out the window and saw the path they had used to get here and the forest they had traveled through. At that moment he became interested in whether there was a hill somewhere around here with the skin of the one on which he played with his older brother. At that moment he remembered his brother's words that he would always be there. Boris thought that most likely such a hill definitely does not exist, because on the lands where he grew up there grows feather grass, and in this estate there are full of flowers, and the people here are kind and open. Despite the fact that everything here is so bright and beautiful, but still all this was absolutely alien to him. Boris went out onto the balcony and looked at the forest. He understood that absolutely everything here was alien, not only the people but also this place. The first words he heard after he opened his eyes, and this is how he slept. His so-called sister was in a hurry to take her father on a tour, but first she decided to show him his room. Rosalind thought his room was beautiful and he could see it for himself. She turned her head and told Boris not to get distracted and to walk next to him so as not to get lost. Boris silently followed his adopted sister. He was wondering if his room was really as beautiful as she said. Rosalind continued to tell that there are 4 towers in the estate. One of them is the Moon Tower, which is located in the south, and his room is located in it. After walking a little further, the girl opened the huge doors and sang Tatum. Boris was really very surprised. He couldn't even imagine that he would have such a room. Then he saw all this luxury and asked again if this was really his room. Rosalind looked at her adopted brother, smiled, and exhaled deeply because this really was his room. At that moment they heard someone's footsteps and someone called the young lady. From behind the door appeared the young lady's assistant, who asked for forgiveness, and then said that she had been so busy working that she had not even noticed how they had left. Rosalina got a little angry with her assistant and said that she didn't bother her. Then she turned away and ordered her assistant to forget that she yelled at her because she was showing Boris around the estate, and her assistant should stay away from them and follow them. The assistant, when she heard that her young mistress had forgiven, exhaled and did everything as she was ordered. Boris thought that in the estate where he lived with his family they also had servants, but they treated them like family members and no one was so nervous in their presence. The young lady came to the next door, opened the door slightly, and said that this was now his bedroom. In just a few seconds they were inside this room. It was as beautiful and luxurious as the previous one. The young lady opened the closet and said that it was already filled with things for Boris, and soon he would be told in what cases he should wear this or that clothing. The young lady said that this room was the best in the estate, not counting of course the piece of their parents. They promised that she would receive it when she turned 15. Then she turned around, looked at Boris, and ordered him to have her brother keep this room clean. Boris looked at his adopted sister and thought that she was very kind to him, even though she knew that he would leave next year. He looked at her and understood that now they would behave like brother and sister, but after a while they would become strangers again. Rosalina continued to show Boris the estate. It was so big that it took quite a long time. They went out onto the balcony and the girl said that Boris looked because there was a beautiful view from this balcony and the sunset was simply amazing. Then they went further and the lady showed him the kitchen and then said that it smelled like something delicious. Boris saw the cooks who were preparing dinner. Then she led the young man into the next room and said that here they have a dining hall, huge and majestic, but it is too big for them, so they usually eat in a small but cozy hall. Rosalind stopped and thought that they weren't finished at this point and that all that was left was the office, so she went to show Boris the office. The girl said that His Grace had probably gone to inspect the property, so they could calmly come in a minute. They were there. The office was really huge and had many shelves filled with books. In the middle of this huge office stood an equally huge table where the Count most likely worked. The young lady said that there are countless books stored in this office. Boris did not show his admiration because he knew perfectly well what the office looked like. Although he very rarely managed to get into his father's office because his father spent all his time there, he caught himself thinking that it was strange to be bored because his father was always cold and with him. He decided that it was all because he probably just realized that he would never again be able to see his father sitting in his office. His memories were interrupted by the loud voice of the young lady. She screamed Lansy. The young lady shouted at the young man who was holding the book in his hands that he was again reading the Count's books without permission. This young man immediately closed the book and did not make excuses. The young lady was indignant for a long time because she couldn't believe that this guy had sneaked into her father's office. This guy was Lansy Rosenkrantz, a servant of Count Bellner who loved to read. Rosalina was very upset, and it seemed that she was about to burst with anger. So she snatched the book from his hands, threw it, attacked him, and started screaming at him, "How dare he do that?" For some time the young lady could not calm down. She shouted at this guy so that he knew his place. Her assistant picked up the book that she had thrown on the floor. Rosalind put her finger on this guy's club and kept yelling at him, and he didn't say a single word. The young lady screamed that she would tell everything that happened in this office to her father, and he would throw him out of the estate. Boris did not understand whether this servant had managed to get into the office in the absence of his master. This servant lowered his eyes, and after the young lady stopped screaming, he began to ask her for forgiveness. This boy said that he made a huge mistake and would never do it again. Boris looked at this guy and thought that he was different from the others, hearing that he was not at all scared when the young lady caught him and scolded him, and now, although he behaves submissively, you can't tell from Patton's voice that he is sincerely sorry. Rosalind thought for a bit and said that this time she forgives, but only because here in this office with her is her brother. If he does it again, then she will definitely report it to her father. The guy bowed and said he understood everything and wished her a good day. When this servant came closer to Boris, he looked at him from top to bottom and assessed him. At that moment Boris realized that this boy, at least it seemed that way to him, was not from Anamarad. For some reason Boris thought that this boy was the same as him. After some time the Count invited Boris to come with him. They were standing in a huge office and all the servants were in front of them. The Count told the servants that they should get acquainted. This is Boris de Bellner, and he installed it 7 years ago. From that moment on, Count Boris would live in the place, so he asked to serve him as faithfully as his daughters. The servant who stood in front of them lowered her head and eyes and said that they agreed. Then the Count added that Boris would need personal servants just like his daughters. The Count suggested that Boris choose who would be his assistant. At that moment Boris looked at the same boy he had met in the office today. Boris that this boy should become his assistant. Boris thought that he doesn't know what he will have to go through here and what mistakes he will make in the future, so it's better to have a peer nearby because he won't notice the details. He decided that he needed to have someone younger and dumber as his assistant. It would be easier to deceive him, so he decided to choose this boy. But for some reason he also wanted to get to know this boy better. After meeting him in the office, he realized that he was not like the other workers. Boris told the Count that he wanted his assistant to be someone his own age. At that moment the Count thought because his age was only one boy from the servants. Then the Count looked and said that the young man on the edge was called Lansy, and if he wanted he could take him as a servant. Then the Count told the boy to come closer. Lansy took a few steps forward to stand in front of Boris. Then the boy lowered his head and said that he greeted the young master, and that his name was Lansy Rosenkrantz. The Count looked at Boris's future assistant and told him to treat Boris with respect and serve him diligently. From now on he would carry out his orders and could forget about the tasks that were given to him earlier. Lansy, without raising his head, answered the Count that he understood everything. Boris looked at this boy and thought that at first glance he seemed very submissive, but he did not feel a drop of respect in his voice. Boris remembered that very scene in the Count's office. Now it became clear to him why Rosalind was so angry. Lansy raised his head and said that he was asking her master for permission to take him into the room. All this was because he needed to talk to Boris. After some time they were in the very room that belonged to Boris for some time. When Lansy entered this room he told Boris to please sit down. Boris sat down on the sofa that stood near the table and told his assistant that he wanted to drink something. This guy who became his assistant null glass of water from the outside. It all seemed very helpful. Boris took the glass and then drank it down in one gulp. After which he put this glass on the table, after which Boris said that he was ready to listen and asked this guy what he wanted to talk to him about. His assistant said that first he should tell him about the Bellner family. About how once every 10 days the gentleman patrols the county territory and every 2 months explores foreign lands. In this regard, sometimes the Count's travels last only 5 days and sometimes they can last a month. This guy continued to tell that most often the Count visits Keltu and also takes local delicacies to sell in the nearby regions. Boris thought that the Count rarely visits the estate. The assistant began to say that even though he was generous with treasures, he was not one of those who easily forgives people who cross the line of what is permitted. Boris thought that it immediately seemed to him that he valued his counties and people very much, but at the same time from 3 to them. Lansy went on to say that the lady is almost always in the estate. She gets up very early and also goes to bed very early. The lady is one of those people who gets thrown off track by even the slightest mistake, so he asked Boris to try not to upset her. At that moment Boris thought that if he upset her it would not be easy to settle everything. Lansy continued his story. He spoke about the smart lady, then he was silent for a while. Then he looked at Boris and said that he thought that Boris already knew what kind of person she was. Boris thought that this guy was not telling him something. Boris thought that he might be afraid to say too much after what happened in the office. He knows how to cleverly avoid problems. His assistant said that in a month the lady will have a birthday party. Aristocrats from different cities, even the capital, have been invited. But the most important guests will be her relatives and the family of the Marquis of Crezon, as well as the families that serve him. The celebration will last 2 days and in the evening will consist of. Lansy asked his new owner if he danced well. Boris was a little confused. Because there was no time for dancing, the Trevaz family did nothing but plot and destroy each other. There was no talk of dance lessons. His assistant said that he believed he was unfamiliar with this art. Then his assistant said that if he wanted he could teach him to dance. Boris looked at him but didn't answer him. He didn't know yet if he wanted to learn this. In this estate everything was so calm and they lived a different life than the one he lived in his estate. Boris asked his new assistant what he had done in this estate before he started serving him. Lansy replied that he served Mr. Bellner and he has been here for almost a year. From the very beginning he served Mr. Boris asked this boy where he lived before. His assistant replied that he lived in Celtica. Boris thought if he lived in the capital of Anamarad, but she is quite far from this estate. Was he really sold as a servant to a rich house? So he asked if his parents were alive. Lansy lowered his eyes and head down. It was hard for him to talk about this topic. But he tried to answer that he doesn't know his parents were in good health when he left, but now he can't say for sure. Boris thought that he didn't need to ask about it. He told his assistant that it turns out he's all alone here. His assistant replied that it was a little bit wrong with him, his younger sister. The boy explained that the master had shown them mercy and allowed her to also settle in the estate. Then he asked the young master to allow him to visit his little sister. Boris raised his head and thought. Then Boris said that he would allow him to do this, but only he would go with him. Lansy was a little worried about this answer. He did not want to go with his master. Then his assistant asked ambiguously whether the gentleman was a gentleman. This question puzzled Boris a little. He did not understand why this boy was asking him about this. Lansy went on to say that he would believe that this was the case. A little girl was sitting on a chair by the huge window and looking out of the window. This girl turned her head to see who came. When Lansy entered this room with his young master, he called her. Despite the fact that her older brother came, she mechanically turned her head in his direction, but she had no joy. Her gaze was lowered and she did not raise her eyes at all. She was not happy about her older brother's arrival. She continued to sit on the same chair. At that moment Boris thought that the girl did not raise her gaze at all. She looked like a weak bud of a white tulip that lacked water and sun. Her face was so pale and expressionless, like that of a soulless wax doll. The assistant asked the young gentleman to sit down here for now and pointed to another chair. Lansy walked up to his sister, took her hand, and said that thanks to the clear weather the view from the window was especially beautiful today. He tried to tell his that another blue bird flew past, very beautiful. He would very much like to show her how the wings of this blue bird sparkle in the sun this morning. Boris looked at his assistant and thought that all this was very nice. He didn't even expect to see such a thing. He thought about the fact that he didn't even know that his assistant had such a side. He couldn't even imagine that he would help share with his sister all the good things that happened during the day. Lansy told her about how many wonderful things there are in the world and described recent events. Boris realized that despite the fact that his assistant looks cold and indifferent, he knows how to notice the beautiful. Boris thought that now the 3 of them were in the same room, but it felt like they were far away from him in their own separate world. Lansy looked at his sister and said that he thought she was in a good mood today. Then he told his sister that no matter what, she shouldn't sit in the sun for too long, and laid her down to take a nap in case she dreamed of Milo Azucena again. Last time she had collected 2 whole. At that moment Boris caught himself thinking that he didn't understand what they were talking about. The brother told his sister to get some sleep. Boris listened attentively to both of them and thought that apparently this was their secret, known only to the 2 of them. Then the older brother picked up his younger sister and carried her to bed. When he laid her down, he told her a few more sweet words about how he wished them sweet dreams. At that moment his face was completely different, not as soulless as all this time he had a smile on his face. Then he turned around and his face became as cold as usual, and he said that it was time for them to go. Boris and his assistant hurried back to the estate as they had other things to do. After some time Boris was drinking tea with his younger sister and telling her everything that had happened to him. The young lady said that she hated this girl. Boris asked her why she was talking like that. The young lady replied that she was very strange. And then she added that she can't stand people like that. She knows how to talk, but for some reason she's always silent, and when she sees her absent-minded look she just wants to flick her. Boris at that moment thought that this girl could still talk, but for some reason was silent, he said to his adopted sister, because she looked unhealthy. And the young lady said that yes, perhaps she was sick, but in her opinion she was simply too lazy, after which she got up from the table and went. Stopping, the young lady added that the only thing that burdens this girl is her limp, but she doesn't even leave the room. In fact, she doesn't read or embroider. She doesn't care about anything else. At that moment her assistant interrupted her and said that the lady asked her to remind her that it was soon snack time. Rosalind was happy and said she had to go because there would be a cream cake today. Look at the Norris, the young lady added that he needs to learn to be grateful, and this girl spends all day loafing and her brother treats her like a goose laying golden eggs. The young lady was already leaving. She stopped and turned around to say something else to her brother. Rosalind told Boris that her father, the Count, had finally found him a teacher based on factual information, and she had heard that the teacher would arrive tomorrow in the first half of the day. He said that everything was clear to him. Then the young lady added that this teacher was a real master of his craft, but a little eccentric. The young lady, as always, was very talkative. She said that maybe her father would allow her to train too. Suddenly she had talent. She was his daughter. After all, Boris understood that she could not learn anything with such a character. Boris couldn't resist and decided to walk around the estate because it was so beautiful there. He thought that he had been asking for work in the estate for several days and he needed to stretch his muscles, otherwise the first training session would not be easy. As he walked through this forest, he noticed one of the trees. He thought it was a walnut tree growing in the middle, and it was not so big that he could hide behind it. When he came closer, Navid thought that these nuts were ripe enough and he wanted to climb this tree. And the only thing that bothered him was that if he climbed a tree, he hoped not to violate any rules of etiquette. Before, when he was at home, his elder brother would take him and put him on his shoulders and he would pick fruits from the trees. Falling closer to this tree, he felt how already ripe nuts were falling on his head. He stopped with us because he didn't understand what had happened and needed to find out who was here. He saw some strange shadow that flashed before his eyes, and this shadow moved faster than this mountain beast. Boris stopped, and Isomer, he was afraid that it could be even worse than he thought. Or is this really the same monster with red eyes that he has already seen many times that lives on Lake Ara? The nuts fell from the tree like raindrops. After looking a little closer, Boris saw that a young man was sitting on the tree and smiling. This young man, when he saw that he had been discovered, asked Boris if he liked nuts. It seemed that he was a rather cheerful young man, pleasant in appearance and very sociable. At that moment Boris exhaled because there was no monster on the tree but an ordinary man. Boris even laughed at himself because he didn't understand why he was so scared. Of course, there was just a man sitting on the branch. And this guy on the branch kept shaking the tree so that the nuts fell. He shouted to Boris to collect them. When Boris ran to the side, this guy jumped from the tree and said that he was looking at a lot of attackers and asked the boy to help him. Boris was a little surprised and didn't understand what kind of manners this guy had, and out of nowhere they were giving him orders. This young man said that he alone would not have been able to cope all day long. He was very lucky because Boris came to the rescue.